Getting a plot started is a scary prospect for many writers, but the reason it's scary varies from writer to writer. Some of us know so much about the story and characters even before we start that we can't decide where to begin. On the other hand, some of us only have a single episode or a single character, and we're not sure how to spin them into a complete narrative. In the first case, it can be hard to pick the right moment out of all the stuff in the story. And in the second case, it's hard to begin if you have no idea where the story is going to end up. Let's see if we can make this less scary. In The Art of Fiction, John Gardner says that a writer works out a plot in one of three ways: by borrowing some traditional plot or an action from real life, the method of the Greek tragedians, Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, and many other writers, ancient and modern, by working his way back from the story's climax, or by groping his way forward from an initial situation. Let's take these one at a time. First, I want to make clear that borrowing a plot is not the same thing as plagiarism, though there have been instances when writers, even very famous ones, have copied ideas so slavishly that they came right up to the edge of, and sometimes over, what we call plagiarism today. Plagiarism generally involves passing off someone else's work as your own. Usually the plagiarist copies the original word for word, or very close to word for word. The kind of borrowing that Gardner is talking about is different. For one thing, it isn't disguised. If a writer bases a story or a novel on a Greek legend, for example, he or she is usually upfront about it. The proof is in the story itself for all to see. For another, most writers who borrow a plot usually change it in significant ways, or use it for a purpose that the original author may not have intended or even foreseen. For example, many writers have retold Homer's Odyssey. The most famous retelling is James Joyce's Ulysses, which uses the Odyssey as a roadmap for the comings and goings of two men in Dublin on one day in 1904. More recently, the Coen brothers used the story of the Odyssey to tell the comic story of three men who escaped from a southern chain gang during the Great Depression in their film, O Brother, Where Art Thou? In each case, the writers took Homer's story and did something new with it, or at least set it in a completely different context. But the debt that these two works owe to the original is clear. Nobody accuses Joyce or the Coen brothers of ripping off Homer. Many writers have done something similar with other great works of literature, telling a well-known or beloved story from a different point of view. Many of these works show us the original in a new light. John Gardner himself retold the story of Beowulf from the point of view of the monster in his novel Grendel. And a number of writers in recent years have reimagined famous stories through the lens of feminism. The American novelist Jane Smiley set Shakespeare's King Lear on an Iowa farm in her novel 1,000 Acres, suggesting that the reason two of Lear's three daughters reject him so badly is that he had sexually abused them when they were girls. In Wide Sargasso Sea, Jean Rhys imagines the backstory of Jane Eyre from the point of view of the first Mrs. Rochester, the famous mad woman in the attic. And Valerie Martin's novel, Mary Riley, retells Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde from the point of view of a poor Irish servant who works in Dr. Jekyll's household. Other writers have had fun by putting a famous story in a new context. In his very clever novel Fangland, the novelist John Marks, who used to work as a producer at 60 Minutes, moves the story of Dracula from the late 19th century and sets it backstage at a TV news magazine in the present day. In each of these examples, the starting point for the writer is determined by the source material. John Marks begins Fangland, for example, with a young American journalist, recently engaged to be married, who is on her way to interview a mysterious Romanian businessman. This reproduces the opening of Dracula, in which a recently engaged English lawyer travels to visit a mysterious Transylvanian nobleman. Then, of course, there are historical novels that are based on the lives of famous people or on events in history. In these narratives, the story, if not the plot, is already laid out for the writer. And as with novels that adapt earlier works of literature, the most interesting historical novels, reimagine the history in interesting ways. Robert Graves' novel I, Claudius and Marguerite Yourcenar's The Memoirs of Hadrian each tell the story of a famous Roman emperor from the emperor's point of view, giving us access to the private lives behind public events. John Banville's Dr. Copernicus is a fictionalized biography of the famous Polish astronomer. It tells the story of Copernicus in chronological order from his early childhood to his death, while giving us something only a novel can provide, namely access to Copernicus's most intimate thoughts. Other novelists have shown us famous people from the point of view of the less famous people around them. In his novel Quarantine, the British novelist Jim Crace reimagines Christ's 40 days in the wilderness from the points of view of several other people who were living in the Judean desert at the time. Sometimes, writers borrow types of plots rather than specific stories. Any beginning writer of mysteries or romance novels probably has a template for that sort of story in her head, whether she likes it or not. And while such a template can be a straitjacket, it can also be a convenient way to at least get a plot started, even if you plan to change it up later on. And sometimes writers borrow a plot not because they're particularly interested in the plot per se, but because they need a structure for what they are interested in. The science fiction writer William Gibson decided to structure his famous first novel, Neuromancer, as an old-fashioned noir thriller in the style of Dashiell Hammett or Raymond Chandler. What he really wanted to do, however, was evoke a complex and colorful future and play with the cultural, social, and political implications of the computer revolution. So he used a thriller plot to provide a framework. Then he attached to it the stuff that really interested him. I did a similar thing with my first published novel, The Wild Colonial Boy. I wanted to write about political violence in Northern Ireland, so I modeled the book after the literary thrillers of writers I admired, including Joseph Conrad, Robert Stone, and John le Carré. And the last of the 3 novellas in my second book, Publish and Perish, is based explicitly on a famous and public domain horror story by the English writer M.R. James, Casting the Runes. James's story is one of the best horror stories ever written, and my version follows his plot pretty closely. But my version also plays what I hope are some interesting variations on the original, by changing the gender of the protagonist, setting it in Texas in the present day, and telling a lot more jokes than the original did. Gardner's next suggestion for getting a plot going is to start with the ending and structure the rest of the story so that it leads to that particular climax. Obviously, this method requires that you know how the story ends before you start writing. It probably works best if you're writing what I called a binary plot a couple of lectures ago. I'll be talking in much more detail about binary endings in the next lecture, but for now, suffice it to say that a binary narrative is one that has a yes or no or an either-or conclusion. The detective catches the murderer or he doesn't, the 2 lovers get together or they don't, or the main character experiences some sort of clear-cut victory or defeat. With a binary narrative, figuring out how to start by working backwards from the ending should be relatively easy. If there's a crime to be solved, you want to start with the crime or its immediate aftermath. If the climax requires the 2 lovers getting together, you need to start with their meeting or the situation that leads to their meeting. The rest of it is just working out the details. This is the method where you're most likely to find that an outline is useful. If you already know what happens at the end, that means you know what the plot needs to do to reach that point. You'll know which characters you'll need, what the setting will be, and roughly what steps the characters have to take to get there. I'm not much of a cook, but I imagine that working backwards from the ending is sort of like a chef tasting a dish and then reverse engineering the recipe to get that taste again. Of course, there are outlines and there are outlines. In my very first lecture, I suggested that a writer might sketch out a story by using the 5 W's of journalism and making a list of the various story elements: who's in it, when it's set, where it's set, what happens, and why things happen. Making such a list in itself doesn't necessarily constitute an outline. It doesn't really tell you how to structure all these elements, but it certainly helps by cutting through the clutter and helping you focus on what's important. But sometimes a more formal outline can be very helpful. I've only used an outline myself once for my novel The Lecturer's Tale. This was the longest and most ambitious book I'd ever attempted up to that point in my career. It's a big, sprawling satire about an English department, with lots of characters who interact with each other in complicated ways. I didn't start with an outline, but about halfway through, I began to feel overwhelmed by everything I had to keep straight. So I took a few days off from actually writing the book and made a giant wall chart. This chart had all the major characters down one axis and all the chapters in the book along the other, and I graphed the movement of each character through the narrative. At first, making the chart was mostly an excuse not to work. I spent way too much time driving all over Austin, Texas, looking for just the right sketch pad and just the right set of colored markers. And then, after putting the chart up on the wall of my office, I quickly found it even more oppressive than trying to keep all the characters straight in my head, so I took it down. But in retrospect, the actual creation of the thing was enormously useful to me, and I'm not sure I ever would have made it to the end of the novel without it. On the other hand, I have more often written things using Gardner's third method of plotting, that is, starting with an image or a character or a situation and groping my way forward. You often hear writers talking about making a start without knowing where they're going. William Faulkner famously talked about how he started his great novel, The Sound and the Fury, with only a single image of a little girl with muddy underpants sitting in a tree, peering through a window at a funeral. If he was telling the truth, and nobody ever mythologized the life and career of William Faulkner the way William Faulkner did, then the fact that he started this way is especially impressive. From that simple beginning, The Sound and the Fury ended up as one of the most structurally complex novels in American literature. In fact, the novel may be complex because of this method, not in spite of it. The book has 4 major sections, told from various points of view. Each section is focused on a single day with flashbacks and flash-forwards. According to Faulkner, this structure was the direct result of trial and error. Here's what he had to say about it. I tried first to tell the story with one brother, and that wasn't enough. That was section 1. I tried it with another brother, and that wasn't enough. That was section 2. I tried the third brother because Caddy was still, to me, too beautiful and too moving to reduce her to telling what was going on, that it would be more passionate to see her through somebody else's eyes, I thought. And that failed, and I tried myself, the 4th section, to tell what happened, and I still failed. Of course, Faulkner's claim that he failed is more than a little disingenuous. What he calls failure turns out to be an incredibly productive way of constructing a complex novel. But it's important to point out that this method is certainly more time-consuming and, along the way, probably more frustrating than constructing an outline and sticking to it. One thing you learn pretty quickly as a writer is that writing fiction is not an efficient process, and that's as it should be. As the example of The Sound and the Fury shows us, most of the time you discover the good stuff by accident along the way. The methods of structuring a plot are not limited to simply 3, of course, as I'm sure even John Gardner would have admitted. You can certainly combine the 3 methods in interesting ways. Even if you're borrowing a plot, you may find yourself monkeying with it. And even if you're trying to stick to the facts of a famous life, such as the life of Hadrian or Copernicus, it's what you discover as you imagine yourself into that person's head that makes the narrative come alive. And it's certainly possible to know how a story ends and still grope your way forward from the beginning, which is how I wrote my novel Next. I knew 4 things about the story when I started: how it ended, where it was set, the fact that it took place in one day, and roughly who my main character was. Apart from that, I knew nothing about what happened between the opening scene and the climax of the book. And yet, even though I knew what the ending was, I still wrote the book as if I didn't. This effort was helped by the fact that the entire narrative is told from the point of view of Kevin, my main character, who of course has no idea either what's going to happen to him on that particular day. Much of the book is just Kevin walking around Austin, Texas in the heat of a summer's morning as he kills time before a job interview. As he walks, he takes stock of his life and remembers scenes from his past in flashback. I honestly had no idea what Kevin's history would turn out to be before I started, and I had only a rough idea of where he was going to walk. But I did have two advantages. I had a basic chronological structure to work with, a single day in Kevin's life, and I had the advantage that I was writing a book set in the town where I live. Each day, I simply rolled out of bed and walked the bit of Austin where Kevin was going to walk. I took note of everything and everyone I saw, and much of what I saw ended up in the novel. What surprised me as I wrote the book, however, was how much those sights and sounds in Kevin's present-day experience provoked ideas for Kevin's previous history. I never would have gotten these ideas if I just sat at my desk and tried to outline his backstory. For example, one of the biggest and most complex scenes in the book takes place in a chain supermarket called Gaia Market, which is my off-kilter version of Whole Foods. In this scene, Kevin stands in Gaia and witnesses a lover's argument. And as he listens to the young couple arguing, he remembers the time that he and his new girlfriend ran into his ex-girlfriend in the Gaia Market in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where he lives. The juxtaposition of a present-day scene with a flashback in a similar setting ended up working really well. In fact, it became one of the key scenes in the book. And it didn't come from an outline. Instead, it was the direct result of me wandering into Whole Foods one morning. The main lesson here is that no matter how you decide to structure your plot, whether you outline it in every detail ahead of time or you just wing it, or you split the difference and do a little of both, you should be prepared to take advantage of happy accidents. Now, if you're still daunted by taking that first step, here's some ideas that may make it easier. First, remember that many stories begin in medias res, which is Latin for in the middle of things. In fact, it's tempting to say that all stories begin in medias res, because there's really no such thing as a story that begins ex nihilo, or from nothing. Even if you start a novel with the birth of the main character, the way Dickens starts David Copperfield, that character already has parents and relations, a family history, and a social and historical context. Or consider the opening line of Genesis, which is probably the least in medias res opening in history. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Even here, there is already a character in place, namely, God. What in medias res usually refers to, however, is starting the plot at a point where the story is already underway. Homer's Iliad starts in medias res. By the time the Iliad opens, the siege of Troy has already been going on for 10 years, and the present time narrative of the Iliad only depicts a few weeks near the end of the siege. Even though the story makes reference to how the war began and how it ends, the Iliad does not dramatize the kidnapping of Helen, which started the war, nor does it dramatize the fall of Troy, which ended it. In Shakespeare's Hamlet, the ghost of Hamlet's father appears in the first scene and tells Hamlet that he was murdered. This means the play has the same structure as a classic murder mystery, where half the story has already taken place by the time the body is found. More recent examples of in medias res include nearly every James Bond film, the opening scene of which usually shows 007 already fighting for his life. Another striking example is the opening scene of the television series Breaking Bad, which shows high school teacher turned meth cook Walter White wearing only his underpants and a gas mask, driving an RV frantically through the desert. This scene happens to be a flash forward. The rest of the episode backs up to show how his recent diagnosis of lung cancer has led him to cooking meth. When we consider the technique of in medias res, we see that choosing where to start a narrative is not necessarily about finding the chronological beginning of the story. Instead, it's about deciding what the most dramatically productive moment is. In other words, what's the beginning moment out of which you can get the most mileage as a storyteller? Shakespeare could have started Hamlet with the funeral of Hamlet's father, or with the marriage of Hamlet's mother to his uncle Polonius. Instead, he chose to open it with the moment that was most likely to make Hamlet reconsider recent events, namely the appearance of his father's vengeful ghost. And the opening of Breaking Bad hooks viewers immediately, making us want to know why this pudgy middle-aged guy is running around in the desert in his tighty-whities waving a gun. The opening of Breaking Bad does what an opening is supposed to do. It strongly suggests what the story is about, in this case middle-class, middle-aged desperation, but it does not explain everything. Yet another way to approach the start of a plot is to limit your choices. As I've said before, real life flows ceaselessly and infinitely in all directions. It's knowing what to leave out that turns life into fiction. You could limit your time frame, for example. Have the story or novel take place in a single day, or a single week, or a single month. You could also limit the point of view. Tell the story from the point of view of only one character. And if that doesn't work, the way it didn't work for Faulkner when he was writing The Sound and the Fury, you could introduce other points of view. You could use leapfrogging narrators, the way Faulkner does in one of his other novels, As I Lay Dying, or the way George R.R. Martin does in his Song of Ice and Fire series. But limiting the time frame doesn't necessarily mean you have to completely leave out other times in the characters' lives. This brings us back to in medias res. You can start the narrative at a particular moment and limit it to a particular time, the way Virginia Woolf limits Mrs. Dalloway to the events of one day. And yet, you could still range backwards and forwards in time and place, the way Mrs. Dalloway incorporates flashback scenes that take place years earlier in completely different settings. But what about that first line, that very first step? Here you have a lot of choices too, each one of which will both dictate and be dictated by what comes later. If you were telling a story from the point of view of a character who dies at the end, for example, you're going to be limited to a third-person narration, unless you want that character to narrate the story from beyond the grave, the way William Holden's character narrates the film Sunset Boulevard, or the way the murdered girl in Alice Sebold's The Lovely Bones narrates the story of her own death. If you're writing a story that features a surprise later on, one that the main character never sees coming, you might want to start in the first-person present tense, or in the close third person. Using these points of view means that the reader lives in the moment right alongside the main character, seeing no more than she sees and knowing no more than she knows. As a result, the result is that the reader is just as surprised as the character is when the moment of surprise finally comes. Perhaps the best thing to do is to take a look at the openings of books and stories you admire. Take into account not just the immediate effect of that moment, but also how that opening prepares the reader for what comes later on. There are as many ways of doing this as there are writers, of course, but we can still group them into some useful categories. There are too many different ways to open a story for me to talk about them all, but here are some examples. One category, of course, is simply beginning at the beginning, the way Tolkien does in The Hobbit. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. This is a very fairy tale way to begin, of course. Even if Tolkien doesn't actually say it, there's an unspoken once upon a time at the beginning of that sentence. But as brief and to the point as it is, that simple 10-word sentence tells us right away that we're in a fantasy world inhabited by creatures called hobbits. It also tells us something important about hobbits, namely that they live underground, which, if you know Tolkien, you'll have to admit turns out to be surprisingly important. Large sections of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings take place underground. Another way to begin at the beginning is simply to state the premise of the story as bluntly as possible. Consider the first line of Franz Kafka's story, The Metamorphosis. One morning, upon awakening from agitated dreams, Gregor Samsa found himself in his bed transformed into a monstrous vermin. And by vermin, Kafka means a cockroach. In this particular translation, the opening sentence is only 19 words. But at the end of it, we know the name of the main character, we know that he is a man riddled with anxiety, and we know that he has undergone a horrific transformation. The rest of the story is essentially just working out all the implications of what it means for a man to be transformed overnight into a giant cockroach. Both of these openings are in the third person. But what if we begin at the beginning in the first person, with the narrator directly addressing the reader? I don't want to say that this is a uniquely American way of opening a novel. This is how David Copperfield begins, after all, as well as Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children. But certainly many of the most famous American novels begin with the narrator speaking directly to the reader. Herman Melville's Moby Dick begins with, "Call me Ishmael." And Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn begins with these famous sentences. "You don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, but that ain't no matter. That book was made by Mr. Mark Twain, and he told the truth mainly. There was things which he stretched, but mainly he told the truth." In this case, the opening is not particularly dramatic, but it draws us in with one of the most distinctive voices in American literature, direct, humorous, and folksy. The opening of Huckleberry Finn also sets the tone of the novel. Whatever happens later, whether it's funny or desperate and profound, we know that we will hear about it from a character who is simultaneously lively and humane. The opening of another great American novel, Marilynne Robinson's Housekeeping, combines the directness of Melville with a straightforward summary of the important characters and the premise of the plot. My name is Ruth. I grew up with my younger sister Lucille under the care of my grandmother, Mrs. Sylvia Foster, and when she died, of her sisters-in-law, Mrs. Lily and Nona Foster, and when they fled, of her daughter, Mrs. Sylvia Fisher. The deceptive simplicity of this draws the reader in, but there is a lot packed in this sentence. Orphan sisters, the death of a grandparent, abandonment. It also sets up the reader for the slow-motion surprise of the rest of the novel as Ruth and Lucille's final guardian, Sylvia, turns out to be one of the most eccentric characters in modern American fiction. Everything in that first sentence is true, but the working out of that situation, two little girls being cared for by a series of older relatives who either die, flee, or turn out to be strange, leads the reader into one of the most mysterious and complex experiences I've ever had as a reader. And it's the straightforward directness of Ruth's voice, her willingness to tell us everything, that keeps us engaged with the novel, no matter how weird and unsettling things get. As I keep saying in these lectures, writing is about imposing order on chaos, about making decisions. These decisions are often arbitrary ones, out of what seem to be an infinity of choices. Writing fiction is also as much about what you leave out as what you leave in. Your decision about when, where, and with whom to begin a narrative opens one path for you, even as it closes off a lot of others. And just like making decisions in real life, sometimes you don't realize what the consequences of your choices are until much, much later. But, unlike life, you can always go back and fix a bad decision, or even start over from scratch. Writing, and especially plotting, is not a science. It's an organic and wildly inefficient process of trial and error. But it's the stuff you don't plan for, the stuff that you don't see coming, the stuff that just presents itself, surprise, as you go along. That's the stuff that makes fiction worth reading and makes the writing of it simultaneously frustrating and rewarding. In the next and final lecture about plot, I'll talk about bringing a narrative to a conclusion, and I'll be focusing on 3 examples. Henry James's novella, The Aspirin Papers, Flannery O'Connor's short story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, and Catherine Mansfield's story, Miss Brill. In the meantime, here's an exercise to help you jumpstart the opening of a story. Imagine, at random and without thinking about it too much, some sort of striking or intriguing situation. For example, imagine a man and woman who are eating at a candlelit table in a romantic restaurant, but they aren't speaking to each other. In fact, they don't even look at each other. Or imagine a woman standing in an alley in the rain at night, holding a knife. Then again, without thinking about it too much, try imagining the very next thing that happens, and then the next, and then the next. If you find yourself running out of steam or boxing yourself into a corner, then go back to the original situation and try something completely different. I think you'll be surprised at how productive this can be. Starting a narrative is daunting. Bringing one to an end can be tricky. You just can't win. The end of a plot is the last thing a reader sees, and what she thinks of the ending often irreversibly colors her opinion of the entire narrative. A plot that has a successful, or at least a vivid and memorable ending, can make a mediocre narrative seem better than it is, while a weak or unconvincing ending can make an otherwise superb narrative lose its luster. Our old friend E.M. Forster thought that wobbly endings were a common problem for novels in particular. He had this to say about it in Aspects of the Novel. Nearly all novels are feeble at the end. This is because the plot requires to be wound up. Why is this necessary? Why is there not a convention which allows a novelist to stop as soon as he feels muddled or bored? Alas, he has to round things off, and usually the characters go dead while he is at work, and our final impression of them is through deadness. Incidents and people that occurred at first for their own sake now have to contribute to the denouement. In the end, even the author feels he is being a little foolish. Most novels do fail here. There is this disastrous standstill while logic takes over the command from flesh and blood. I suspect this is a bit tongue-in-cheek. Given that Aspects of the Novel is essentially a celebration of careful craftsmanship, I doubt that Forster is entirely serious when he wishes that novelists could just stop as soon as they get muddled or bored. And remember that Forster was notoriously ambivalent about plot. Remember how he said in a droopy, regretful voice that, yes, oh dear, yes, the novel tells a story. But even so, Forster is expressing a peevishness that all writers feel at one time or another. He's also right that it's not uncommon for novels, even great ones, to fall apart at the end. The last quarter of Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is notoriously weak, especially after Tom Sawyer turns up in the story. The comedy turns labored, the narrative loses momentum, and the plot is resolved in a series of unconvincing contrivances. You can tell that Twain got, well, muddled and bored and just wanted to wrap things up. One of my favorite books, Joseph Conrad's Nostromo, has the most brilliant opening third of any novel I've ever read. The last third of it is much more melodramatic and conventional than the rest of the book. It's almost as if Conrad got tired or lost his nerve toward the end. There are some other factors at play that make endings difficult to talk about. For one thing, what people consider a good ending is dependent on individual taste. For example, many readers are disappointed if a romance doesn't end with the couple getting together, while others think a conventional happy ending is sentimental and unrealistic. For another thing, what writers and readers consider a good ending has changed over time. The endings of many great 19th century novels now strike many modern readers as contrived and unconvincing. Charles Dickens is indisputably a great writer, but some of his novels have endings that seem ludicrously sentimental to a modern reader. The good characters find love, security, and happiness, while the bad characters are either humiliated or killed off. Or, in the case of Fagin in Oliver Twist, they are humiliated and killed off. Some classic novels seem unconvincing to a modern reader because our cultural, social, and moral assumptions have changed. Women who have sex outside of marriage are no longer expected to kill themselves, the way they do in several famous 19th century novels. And some famous 19th century endings have been so widely imitated that they've become hackneyed. At the end of Jane Eyre, a poor but intelligent and virtuous woman wins the love of a brooding, sexually magnetic rich guy. However original this may have been when Charlotte Bronte was alive, now it's a trope in modern romance novels and a cliché of Hollywood romantic comedies. But even if they disagree about the particulars, nearly everyone agrees on the two fundamental qualities that a good ending should have. Namely, it should be both believable and satisfying. Believability and satisfaction are not the same, however, and they are not interchangeable. It's possible for an ending to be believable without being satisfying. In real life, for example, killers often get away with murder, or two lovers who seem perfect for each other never actually get together. Neither of these outcomes would be very satisfying in a conventional narrative. However, on the other hand, it's not possible for an ending to be both satisfying but not believable. If the killer is caught, or the lovers are brought together as a result of a blatant contrivance on the part of the author, the ending is unsatisfying because we don't believe it. And it should go without saying that a satisfying ending is not necessarily a happy one. Some of the greatest literary novels ever written have unhappy endings. And in recent decades, a lot of first-rate genre fiction has come to rely on unhappy but dramatically satisfying endings. George R.R. Martin's A Game of Thrones, the first novel in his Song of Ice and Fire series, ends with the death of the novel's noblest character. So what do we mean when we say that an ending is believable? In part, believability depends on what we as readers bring to a story. Our own individual understanding of how the world works and what real people are like helps determine what we will believe in a work of fiction. This doesn't mean the rules of the real world can't be bent. Readers are willing to accept that the laws of nature can be altered, broken, or ignored in fantasy, horror, and science fiction, as long as you provide an alternate set of rules for your fictional world and stick to them. Readers of any genre, however, are less likely to believe a character whose final actions violate their understanding of human psychology. Different readers have different expectations of how human beings think and behave, or how human beings ought to think or behave. An ending that strikes one reader as completely plausible and even admirable will strike another reader as preposterous and even offensive. Take the ending of Jane Eyre again. Mr. Rochester may be brooding and sexually magnetic, but he persuades Jane to fall in love with him without bothering to tell her that he's already married and that he's keeping his crazy first wife locked in his attic. And yet, at the end of the novel, after a series of twists that include a surprise inheritance for Jane and a house fire that conveniently kills the first Mrs. Rochester, Jane Eyre happily marries Mr. Rochester. Most readers accept this ending. For one thing, we take into account the narrative conventions of the time the novel was written. For another, we want Jane to be happy because she is such an admirable character. Still, it's possible to imagine a reader who just can't believe that someone as smart and independent as Jane would give someone as manipulative and self-serving as Mr. Rochester a second chance. Our willingness to believe the ending of Jane Eyre depends partly on our general understanding of human nature, but it also depends on our understanding of Jane Eyre herself as an individual character. If character is more fundamental to fiction than plot, as I argued in Lecture 3, then the key to crafting a believable ending is staying true to the nature of your characters. You can make an ending believable if you can get the reader to play along with the premise of your narrative, and if you play fair with the reader by obeying your own rules. But respecting your own characters is especially important. But, as I said a moment ago, just because an ending is believable doesn't make it satisfying. In the terminology of my long-dormant bachelor's degree in philosophy, believability is a necessary condition of a satisfying ending, but not a sufficient one. And as we've just seen, believability isn't an absolute quality. Reasonable people can disagree over whether an ending is credible or not. But satisfaction is an even more ineffable and unquantifiable quality, one that is even more dependent on taste and personal experience. You can at least make a case that a particular ending is believable. You can argue that it's prepared for, that the writer played by the rules, and so on. But you cannot convince a skeptic that an ending is satisfying, any more than you can make someone change his mind about a food he doesn't like. If you don't like onions, no amount of argument is going to make you like onions. Consider the passionate arguments that erupt online or around water coolers after the final episodes of such popular television series as The Sopranos or Breaking Bad. If you were annoyed and unsatisfied at the abrupt disappearance of Tony Soprano in the very last moments of his final episode, no amount of passionate exegesis from me is going to change your mind. Just as it is with onions, satisfaction is a wholly subjective judgment. Endings are a matter of taste. And as the Latin maxim has it, de gustibus non est disputandum. In matters of taste, there can be no dispute. At this point, perhaps we should throw up our hands like E.M. Forster, but as even he would admit, yes, oh dear yes, a work of fiction must have an ending. So let's just accept the fact that an ending cannot be all things to all people, And let's take a look at 3 endings that are considered satisfying by most readers. In The Art of Fiction, our other old friend, John Gardner, says that there are 2 ways a narrative can end. In resolution, when no further event can take place, the murderer has been caught and hanged, the diamond has been found and restored to its owner, the elusive lady has been captured and married. Or in logical exhaustion, our recognition that we've reached the stage of infinite repetition. More events might follow, perhaps from now till kingdom come, but they will all express the same thing. Now, this is an oversimplification because there are other types of endings, not to mention hybrid varieties, but these 2 definitions probably cover most possibilities. Let's start with the sort of ending Gardner calls resolution, but which I have called a binary ending. As you may recall, this is the kind of ending that resolves an either-or situation or answers a simple question that was posed in the opening pages of the narrative. This is the sort of ending you find in most best-selling novels, popular movies, and television shows. Who committed the crime? Will the 2 star-crossed lovers get together? Will the intelligence agent foil the supervillain's plot? Will the hero of the epic fantasy complete his quest? Plots with binary endings are often dismissed as mechanical and contrived, and to be honest, many of them are. You could even argue that the endings of some of these simple binary narratives is the least important thing about them, and the real reason we enjoy them is that we enjoy the setting or the characters. For example, I used to watch reruns of the television drama Law and Order obsessively. Even when I knew I'd seen an episode once or twice already, I'd watch it again anyway, because I could never remember how it turned out. I came to realize that my pleasure in watching the show didn't come from the ending, but from the time I spent in the company of characters like Sam McCoy or Lenny Briscoe. This is often the case with well-written genre narratives. The journey is interesting, even if the destination turns out to be unmemorable. But let's not dismiss binary endings out of hand. There are a lot of great narratives where the ending is both immensely satisfying and unforgettable, and maybe even the high point of the story. John le Carré's great spy novel, Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy, is the story of a veteran British spy named George Smiley, who was asked by the British Intelligence Service to find a Soviet mole in their midst. This is a binary ending with a vengeance, along the lines of a classic country house mystery. Smiley assembles a list of suspects and investigates each one. Then, in a sweaty-palmed climactic scene, he discovers which one of his colleagues actually is a Soviet spy. Much of the fun of the book lies in the twists and turns of the investigation, and in le Carré's sharp delineation of his large cast of characters. But the ending is tremendously satisfying and not mechanical or contrived at all. This is because le Carré complicates the ending by making the mole an upper-class Englishman and a former lover of Smiley's wife. This means that the mole is not just a traitor to his country, but a traitor to his class and to his professional colleagues. It's a binary ending with layers, because the mole's betrayal is at once political, social, and personal. Many literary novels also have binary endings. Will Elizabeth Bennet marry Mr. Darcy in Pride and Prejudice? Will Ahab catch and kill Moby Dick? Will Jay Gatsby win Daisy Buchanan back from her brutish husband in The Great Gatsby? One literary story in particular has perhaps the most satisfying binary ending I've ever read. Henry James's novella, The Aspern Papers, is narrated by an unnamed literary critic whose passion is a long-dead American poet named Jeffrey Aspern. The critic has learned that some letters from Aspern may still be in the possession of the poet's former lover, who is now a very old woman living in Venice. The critic then goes to Venice, where he learns that the old woman, Juliana Bordereau, is living in a decaying old palazzo in the company of her plain, middle-aged niece, Miss Tina. Because Juliana and Miss Tina are living in poverty, the critic insinuates himself into their house by renting a room from them. And because he suspects that Juliana has no intention of letting anyone see the letters, he tries to allay her suspicions by pretending to be romantically interested in Miss Tina. This is a tight little triangle of characters: the unscrupulous narrator, the suspicious old woman in possession of a priceless literary treasure, and the lonely middle-aged woman. And it sets up not one, not 2, but 3 binary questions. Will the critic get the letters? Will Juliana discover his true intentions? Will the critic callously break Miss Tina's heart? James shows us the wary dance of these 3 characters through a series of impeccably crafted scenes, each one of which ratchets the tension up a little higher. The novella culminates in an almost gothic climax in the middle of the night, when the narrator tries to break into the desk where he thinks the letters might be hidden and is caught in the act by Juliana. She curses him and he flees the house. Juliana dies soon thereafter, and the narrator returns to the house to ask Miss Tina if she might let him have the papers. Miss Tina hints that she might, if he agrees to marry her. The narrator flees again, because he can't imagine marrying someone he thinks of as a ridiculous, pathetic, provincial old woman. It goes without saying that the narrator of the aspirin papers is no prince. But he's desperate for the papers. So in the final pages of the novella, when the narrator returns once more to the palazzo, where Miss Tina has changed somehow, as he puts it, her look of forgiveness, of absolution, made her angelic. It beautified her. She was younger. She was not a ridiculous old woman. This trick of her expression, this magic of her spirit, transfigured her. And while I still noted it, I heard a whisper somewhere in the depths of my conscience. Why not? After all, why not? It seemed to me I could pay the price. In other words, at the end of the story, the critic is tempted to marry Miss Tina in order to get the letters. Then, on the very last page of the novella, Henry James springs the trap he has expertly laid for both the narrator and the reader, when Miss Tina reveals that she burned the letters one by one the night before. And so the aspirin papers fulfills the reader's expectations by answering all 3 of the binary questions it posed at the start. No, the critic does not get the papers. Yes, Juliana discovers his true intentions. As for the 3rd question, will Miss Tina's heart be broken? The answer turns out to be the most satisfying twist in the story, because Miss Tina turns out to be as skillful and ruthless a player as the narrator. If the narrator did break her heart, Miss Tina earns her revenge by breaking his, by denying him the one thing he ever really wanted. This is storytelling of the highest order. Henry James not only imagines a binary situation that generates suspense, he peoples the plot with 3 vivid and sharply defined characters and stays true to them. There is the conniving narrator who isn't nearly as clever as he thinks he is. There is the mistrustful old woman who has spent a lifetime living in the shadow of a famous poet. And there is the watchful spinster who shines with beauty in her one moment of bitter triumph. The reversal at the end is the best kind of surprise, where the reader is thinking simultaneously, I did not see that coming, and of course. Now let's talk about the sort of ending that Gardner calls a case of logical exhaustion. This is the point at which a narrative has reached its deepest understanding of a character or a situation, and beyond which it would just be repeating itself. This sort of ending does not rely on raising a binary expectation in the reader, but it does require the early pages to draw the reader into the narrative by setting up an expectation in the reader that some sort of revelation is going to occur. A variety of this kind of ending is the epiphany, which I explained a couple of lectures ago. The example I used then was James Joyce's long story, The Dead. But this time, I want to talk about the short story Miss Brill by Catherine Mansfield, one of Joyce's contemporaries. It's only 5 pages long, and like many Epiphany stories, it doesn't really have a plot. But like the best of the Epiphany stories, it is carefully constructed to deliver a devastating emotional blow at the end. Miss Brill is a late middle-aged Englishwoman who lives alone in a rented room in a seaside town in France, where she makes her living teaching English. Every Sunday, she sits on a bench in the public gardens, listening to a brass band and watching the crowd pass by. She especially enjoys eavesdropping on the conversations of the other people who sometimes share her bench. In the opening paragraph, Miss Brill is seated on the bench on a bright but slightly chilly Sunday afternoon. She is wearing a fox stole, the sort of fur wrap that still has the head, feet, and tail of the fox at either end. And she recalls the pleasure she took in lifting it out of its box and brushing it before she put it on and left her room. The middle section of the story is like Georges Seurat's brilliantly detailed pointillist painting, A Sunday on La Grande Jatte, as Miss Brill observes the old married couple on the bench next to her, watches children play, and witnesses an old woman trying unsuccessfully to flirt with an elderly man. She takes delight in thinking of the scene as a kind of play in which she's one of the actors. She even enters into a lovely fantasy in which everyone in the park starts to sing along with the band. The young ones, the laughing ones who were moving together, they would begin, and the men's voices, very resolute and brave, would join them. And then she too, and the others on the benches, they would come in with a kind of accompaniment, something low, that scarcely rose or fell, something so beautiful, moving. And Miss Brill's eyes filled with tears, and she looked smiling at all the other members of the company. Yes, we understand, she thought, but what they understood, she didn't know. This moment when Miss Brill feels a communion with all the other people in the park is immediately ruined, however. An amorous young couple sit on the bench next to her, and the girl refuses to kiss the boy because of that stupid old thing at the end of the bench. It takes a moment for the reader and Miss Brill to realize that the stupid old thing she's referring to is Miss Brill herself. The girl goes on to make fun of Miss Brill's beloved fox stole by comparing it to a dead fish. Then the story jumps abruptly to its last two paragraphs, where Miss Brill returns to her tiny, shabby room and sits on the bed for a long time. The story ends like this. The box that the fur came out of was on the bed. She unclasped the necklet quickly, without looking, laid it inside. But when she put the lid on, she thought she heard something crying. I'm not sure my summary can evoke the story's power, but I hope it gives you at least an idea of the elements that make it work. Every sharply observed detail and every slight shift of emotion builds toward a single piercing epiphany. Mansfield starts by introducing a woman whose most elegant possession is an old fox stole, which she treats with loving care because it reminds her of her youth. Then, in the middle section, in the manner of Mrs. Dalloway, Mansfield shows us the park through Miss Brill's eyes and allows us to participate in Miss Brill's reactions. We see how she prides herself on her gift of quiet observation, and we share the slight superiority she feels towards the people she observes so sharply. Then we share her moment of communion. She is one of the people in the park, after all, one of the players in this play they all put on each Sunday. She takes brief respite from her loneliness by indulging in the fantasy of everyone singing together, only to have her illusions shattered by two thoughtless young lovers. And just as the end of the aspirin papers clicks shut like a trap on the last page, so does the last paragraph of Miss Brill. The title character suddenly and unexpectedly sees herself as the world sees her. And from that slight observational remove that she was so proud of in the park, she can hear herself weeping. There is no binary plot here, no situation to resolve. But we have reached the point that Gardner called logical exhaustion. Miss Brill has had a devastating insight into her own life, and the reader has shared that devastating insight. This insight changes everything that Miss Brill and the reader had thought up to this point, and it cannot be taken back. Her life will go on, but there is nothing new left to learn. The story moves sentence by sentence with ruthless efficiency to an ending that's every bit as precision engineered and every bit as powerful as the end of the aspirin papers. Let's look now at a sort of hybrid ending, existing halfway between the binary ending and the epiphany. Flannery O'Connor's story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, is about a Southern family who take a drive to Florida and end up being murdered on a lonely country road by a serial killer. The killer, who is called the Misfit, is mentioned in the story's very first paragraph. The grandmother of the family, who is the story's main point-of-view character, reads aloud from the newspaper about his recent escape from prison. After that, the Misfit is mentioned only once more, briefly, before he and his henchmen turn up later in the story, after the family has driven its car into a ditch. Meanwhile, the central portion of the story is a comic portrayal of the family bickering with each other in the car and stopping for barbecue. The reappearance of the Misfit might have been a Dickensian coincidence in the hands of a lesser writer. But his appearance in the newspaper in the first paragraph is played for laughs. As a result, when he reappears at the end, full of genuine menace, the reader's experience mirrors that of the family as they slowly realize they're about to die. This can't be happening, you think the first time you read the story, which is exactly what the family must be thinking. But because it is so skillfully prepared for, the ending leads you to a radical change of perspective. Instead of finding the coincidence unbelievable, you find instead that the ending alters your understanding of everything that came before. The grandmother's foolishness, for example, which was funny and kind of sweet for most of the story, ends up becoming tragic and pitiable. The offhand references to the misfit in the first paragraph and briefly again in the middle of the story turn out to be foreshadowing. They are hints, if only we'd picked up on them, of a version of the world that is both profound and terrifying. The story closes with the same finality as the aspirin papers. O'Connor prepares for her ending with as much skill as Henry James does. But where Henry James lays his plot points out where the reader can see them, O'Connor hides hers behind a scrim of irony. The misfit is foreshadowed in the first paragraph, but in such a way that a first-time reader doesn't suspect he's important. He's just the groundless fear of an old woman. And O'Connor also skillfully underplays the plot twists that lead to the family's death. It is the grandmother's insistence that they take a side trip to visit a house she used to know that leads to their accident. And what seals the family's doom is the fact that she calls the misfit by his nickname as soon as she sees him. These two mistakes by the grandmother are simultaneously shrewdly observed bits of her character and tripwires that lead inevitably to her death and to the deaths of her loved ones. The ending of A Good Man is hard to find, falls halfway between a binary ending and an epiphany. On the one hand, it ends definitively, with the murder of several of its characters. But like an epiphany story, it radically changes everything the reader thought about what came before. It doesn't answer a question that was openly posed at the beginning of the story, but instead it answers a question that the reader didn't even realize was being posed until after he finishes the story. The question is the world a safe place? And the story answers with a definitive no. What makes these three endings satisfying? I can't say for certain, because not every reader will necessarily find them as satisfying as I do. But I can tell you what they have in common. Each one is prepared for, starting with the first page or even the first paragraph of the narrative. The opening of the aspirin papers sets up all three binary questions that the ending answers. The misfit is mentioned in the very first paragraph of A Good Man is Hard to Find. And Miss Brill's faded fox stole, the symbol of her own faded appeal, is mentioned in the very first paragraph. Think back to John Gardner's definitions of how a narrative can end, that a story either resolves or it logically exhausts itself. All three of these endings essentially leave the reader with nothing left to know. Each writer has taken us as far as we can go. All the major questions are answered, and we have gained our deepest understanding of the situation or the characters. In the last lecture, I talked about two ways of starting a plot. One is to work toward an ending you already know. The other is to let the plot tell you what the ending should be. All three of these endings are more or less airtight and perfectly prepared for. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Henry James, Catherine Mansfield, and Flannery O'Connor knew the ending of each story before they started. They may very well have. I don't actually know. But it seems to me that either method may generate a satisfying ending. At first glance, it might seem that knowing the ending in advance is the easiest way to write, because you can direct the story at every point to head in that direction. But you also run the risk of forcing the characters in a particular direction whether they want to go there or not. In that case, your plot can seem contrived and unlifelike, and your characters seem more like puppets than living, breathing people. It may be that not knowing where you're going is easier than planning ahead. Not knowing where you're going may even lead to a more satisfying ending. You may also find that your ending arises effortlessly and organically from the situation and the characters as a natural and inevitable result of your choices along the way. Of course, with this method, you may also find that you have painted yourself into a corner, or have drafted a narrative that just peters out. Either way, you're running the risk of having to go back and start again, but hey, that's showbiz. Way back in the second lecture, I talked about how literature is the creation of order out of chaos, the creation of meaning out of an otherwise meaningless existence. The ending of a narrative is where that meaning is most sharply defined. The ending is where the hidden patterns are finally revealed. The ending is where, at least for a fleeting moment, we understand everything that came before. In other words, perhaps the secret of a satisfying ending of any variety is not that it's definitive or revelatory or happy or unhappy. Perhaps the secret of a satisfying ending is that there's nothing left to say. With the next lecture, I'll be starting a block of 3 lectures about point of view. In the first lecture, I'll be talking in general about the wide range of points of view, touching briefly on a variety of works, including George Eliot's Middlemarch, Marilyn Robinson's Housekeeping, and Nabokov's Lolita. In the meantime, here's an exercise to help you think about crafting an ending. Take a story or a novel you really love and imagine a different ending for it. Then work back to see what you'd have to change to make the new ending believable and satisfying. Take Jane Eyre as an example. Jot down a rough outline of everything in the book that leads to Jane's marriage to Mr. Rochester, then imagine a different ending. Perhaps she marries someone else in the novel, or she decides to go live by herself on her inheritance money. Then go back through the outline and see what you'd have to change in the story to make the new ending work. And how can you tell I have reached the end of this lecture? Because I have nothing left to say. As I said in my earlier lectures about character, fiction gives us access to the consciousness of other people. This is just another way of saying that fiction allows us to see the world from someone else's point of view. Point of view is just as fundamental to fiction as character and plot. It's hard, if not impossible, to imagine a work of fiction without any characters in it, and by the same token, it's pretty much impossible to imagine a work of fiction that has no point of view. Even the most remote third-person narrative, which watches human behavior without judgment as if through a security camera, is a particular point of view. Just as there are different ways to create character or structure a plot, there are a wide variety of points of view. There's the imperial, godlike third person of the great 19th century authors such as George Eliot or Leo Tolstoy. There's the intimate, limited third person of a high modernist novel like Mrs. Dalloway, shifting from one character to the next. Or there's the distinctive first person of books as different from each other as Jane Eyre, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Heart of Darkness, Lolita, or Housekeeping. Choosing a point of view is not just about deciding whether to use the third person or the first person. Choosing a point of view also determines the style and tone of the narration, specifically the quality that writers call voice. Think about a favorite novel or short story, especially one that is narrated in the first person, and I'll bet that what you remember mainly is the narrator's voice. Long after most of us have forgotten the plot details of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, we remember the sly, slangy voice of Huck himself. We remember Jane Eyre's grit and restrained passion. We remember Humbert Humbert's creepy erudition in Lolita. Each one of these individual voices not only evokes the character who is telling the story, it also determines the tone, sensibility, and moral stance of the narrative. Jane Eyre's decency and stubborn determination aren't just a reflection of her own personality. They represent Charlotte Bronte's view of what people are like and how the world works. It's important to remember that Mark Twain is not Huck Finn, and that Charlotte Bronte is not Jane Eyre, and that Nabokov is not Humbert Humbert. In the next lecture, I'll talk more about the double consciousness of the first-person narrator. It's even possible for a writer to create a first-person narrator who may not be telling the truth, the way Eudora Welty does in her short story, Why I Live at the P.O. I'll also talk about that technique known as an unreliable narrator in the next lecture. But as distinctive as a first-person narration can be, it's not as if first-person narrators have all the fun. A third-person narration can have as distinctive a voice as a first-person narrator. One of the great hallmarks of a great author, in fact, is the way his or her distinctive voice can become another character in the narrative, even if that voice isn't actually participating in the story. You can't read Dickens, for example, without coming away with a vivid impression of the author himself, even when he's writing in the third person, maybe even especially when he's writing in the third person. His great novel Bleak House is written in both the first and the third person, and you can't read it without getting a vivid idea of which characters Dickens approves of and which ones he doesn't. It's clear what makes Dickens angry, what makes him laugh, and what he thinks is the moral thing to do. His unique view of humanity, expressed with his boundless energy, is present on every page. George Eliot's great novel Middlemarch is written in the third person, but it also features frequent comments directly from the author. As a result, when you read Middlemarch, you're not only following the characters in the story, you're engaging with one of the sharpest and least sentimental intellects in English literature. And if you read Bleak House and Middlemarch one right after the other, and that's a lot of reading because they are both great big books, you can see right away that you could never mistake Eliot's voice for Dickens's or vice versa. As I keep reminding you throughout these lectures, writing fiction is all about making choices. When it comes to point of view, you have to decide whether your story will be told by someone in the story or by an outside narrator. You also have to decide what voice that character or that narrator is going to use. Choosing a point of view and a voice not only determines the perspective from which the story and the plot are viewed, it also determines which characters you include and how you depict them, as well as what actually happens in the narrative. Choosing a point of view is one of the most important decisions you will make. In this lecture, I want to take a quick tour of the most important types of point of view. Then, in the next two lectures, we'll look at the first-person point of view and then the third-person point of view in more detail. I have found that it sometimes helps to think of point of view as something literal, as a way of looking at a landscape, for example. Imagine your setting as an actual landscape with plains, mountains, valleys, forests, and deserts. Your story is what happens to your characters as they move across this landscape. Let's think of the different types of point of view as actual points along the curve of the sky arching over the story, from the highest point overlooking the entire landscape to the lowest point, right down at ground level, where a character or a narrator can only see what's directly in front of him or her. Let's start with the third-person point of view. As we'll discover in more detail in a subsequent lecture, there are different types of third person. The most all-inclusive variety is the third-person omniscient point of view, right at the zenith of our metaphorical sky. This is the point of view in which the author and the narrator seem to be more or less the same person, though that's not necessarily the case. As John Gardner puts it, the omniscient narrator is a persona of the author. Whether or not this narrator is the same person as the author, this sort of narration sees all and is capable of revealing everything there is to know about the characters. This point of view is often called godlike, because the narration is like an all-powerful, all-knowing deity who can not only see the entire landscape beneath, but into the hearts and minds of its characters. This type of narration can place a character in her historical, political, and social context at the same time, as it can reveal her most intimate secrets. This variety of the third-person point of view is often associated with the 19th century, when it was used without irony by such great writers as George Eliot and Leo Tolstoy. With the rise of modernism and postmodernism, the omniscient point of view came to be used more ironically. Even so, it was the point of view that dominated fiction right through the middle of the 20th century, often in large-scale novels that have a lot of characters and often evoke whole communities. A good example is Paula Marshall's The Chosen Place, The Timeless People, an epic novel about life on a Caribbean island which was published in 1969. More recently, Jonathan Franzen, in his novels The Corrections and Freedom, has adopted a godlike point of view. So has the British novelist Nicola Barker in her novel Darkmans, which depicts the members of a community even as it enters into the consciousness of each of its characters as intimately as Mrs. Dalloway does. A little closer to the ground along our curve of sky, but still pretty high up, is the third-person objective point of view. We've already encountered a good example of this point of view in Dashiell Hammett's detective novel, The Maltese Falcon. As I said when we were discussing this novel earlier, the interesting thing about the point of view of The Maltese Falcon is that we see and hear everything each character does, but we never get inside their heads. The omniscient third person of Tolstoy or Eliot can dip into the heads of an individual character like Anna Karenina or Dorothea Brooke and inhabit her consciousness for a time, showing us what she is thinking and feeling. But the objective third person is more like a video camera. It records and reports everything it sees, but it doesn't tell us anything about the character's private feelings, thoughts, or motivations. This point of view may even be the most lifelike one. After all, we can't read the minds of other people in real life, and the objective point of view reproduces what it feels like as we try to guess, from their speech, actions, and gestures, what other people around us are thinking. But even though it's more lifelike than the third-person omniscient, it's also a colder point of view, because it cannot engage intimately with the minds of its characters. Now, moving down along the dome of our imaginary sky, we find a spot about halfway down, midway between the omniscient third person and the most intimate first-person narration. This point of view is known as the close third person or the limited third person. More recently, it has also come to be known as free indirect discourse. In the close third person, the narration uses third-person pronouns such as he, she, and they, instead of first-person pronouns such as I or we. And like the omniscient third person, it gets inside the heads of its characters. But in the limited third person, the whole story or novel is generally told from the point of view of only one character. John Updike, for example, used the close third person in his series of 4 novels about the life of Harry Rabbit Angstrom. These novels are written in the third person, but they are mainly told from the point of view of Rabbit himself. The close third person, in fact, is the default mode of much contemporary fiction. But the close third person doesn't have to be limited to one character. Often, writers will alternate the points of view between several characters within the same narrative, the way Toni Morrison does in Beloved. William Faulkner's Light in August also shifts between several different point of view characters, all of them expressed in the third person. In fact, the close third person point of view can easily turn into the omniscient third person. Much of George Eliot's Middlemarch, for example, is written from the point of view of one character or another, but Eliot often shifts into the omniscient point of view, often within a chapter or even within a paragraph. However, the traditional omniscient third person is usually more remote from its characters and capable of making sweeping judgments about society or whole classes of people. For whatever reason, modern novels written in the more intimate, close third person tend to shy away from those kinds of judgments. Still, the close third person allows the author to pull back the camera if he wants to. It allows him to comment directly on the action or to show us something the point of view character can't or doesn't know. Moving further down the curve of the sky, the close third person shades into what you might call the objective first person. Like the close third person, which uses third-person pronouns to limit itself to the perspective of one character, the objective first person is a hybrid point of view. It uses the first-person pronoun I, but still maintains a certain distance from the action of the narrative. In other words, in the objective first person, the story or novel is being narrated by a fictional character, but one who either plays only a minor part in the story or isn't actually present in the story at all. 2 good examples are Ishmael in Moby Dick and Nick Carraway in The Great Gatsby. In much of Moby Dick, Ishmael acts mainly as a recording eye, telling what he sees and hears, even though he's technically a crew member of the Pequod and a character in the story. He involves himself in the work of the crew, but his story is not the main story of the book, and he is not the main character. Captain Ahab is. Instead of taking center stage, Ishmael does two things. One is to tell us the story of Captain Ahab's obsession with the great white whale. The other is to evoke, almost like a documentary filmmaker, the way of life aboard a whaling vessel. In the second half of the novel, in fact, much of Ishmael's narration is in effect in the third person. There are even scenes that take place when Ishmael isn't even present. In The Great Gatsby, Nick Carraway is slightly more important to the story. The character of Daisy is his cousin, and he plays a role in bringing Gatsby and Daisy together over the course of the book. Furthermore, it's Nick's voice that passes judgment on the events of the story, and it's his voice that sums up the meaning of the book in those famous final lines. But the main story is not about Nick. It's about Gatsby and Daisy. You could easily imagine a version of The Great Gatsby written in the third person, where Nick is just a minor character, and F. Scott Fitzgerald himself takes on the responsibility of passing judgment at the end. A variant of this type of first person is the first person plural narration, in which the author uses the pronoun we and adopts the collective point of view of a community of people. One of the best-known examples is William Faulkner's famous Gothic short story, A Rose for Emily, which is narrated from the point of view of the town itself. In this classic story, the first-person plural has the effect of drawing the reader in and making her a de facto member of the community. In fact, the complicity implied in the use of the pronoun we has the further effect of making the story's chilling ending even more shocking. The first-person plural isn't used very often, but it's still a technique that can generate interesting results. In recent years, the American writer Joshua Ferris wrote his first novel, Then We Came to the End, from the point of view of a group of office workers at a Chicago advertising agency. Now let's move along the curve of the sky as far down as we can go. Here, right down at ground level, is the subjective first person. In this point of view, the first-person narrator is one of the main characters in the story, and often the main character. Unlike Ishmael in Moby Dick, who is the narrator but not the main character, Huck Finn is both the narrator and the main character of the adventures of Huckleberry Finn. We see and hear everything in the book through Huck's eyes, and we can only know what Huck witnesses or hears about. Not only that, but Huck's moral journey is the heart of the novel, as he befriends the escaped slave Jim and decides not to turn him in to the authorities. In more recent times, as the subjective first person has become more prevalent, we have narrators like Ruth in Marilyn Robinson's Housekeeping. Ruth is one of the three main characters in the book, and her decision about how she wants to live her life represents the book's climax. And there's the chilling Humbert Humbert in Nabokov's Lolita, who tells us of his illicit passion for the 12-year-old Dolores Hayes. This is one of the most disturbing uses of the subjective first person in all of literature. The curve of sky representing the different points of view is a continuum, of course, and these are just the principal compass points on it. Narratives can and do find points in between the ones I've just described. For example, a first-person narrator can be an unreliable narrator who lies or withholds certain crucial information or misunderstands what's actually going on. And many books mix and match points of view. In Anna Karenina and Middlemarch, both Tolstoy and George Eliot vary the scope of their third person. Sometimes they give us a wide-angle, omniscient view encompassing whole groups or communities of people. But sometimes they use the limited third person to get deep inside the head of a single character. Tolstoy, for example, goes so deep inside Anna's head near the climax of Anna Karenina that he approaches the extremely intimate third person you find in high modernist novels like Mrs. Dalloway. Some books jump back and forth between the third and first person. Dickens' great novel Bleak House is told from both the third person and the first person point of view. Even more recently, John Burnham Schwartz's novel Reservation Road has three main characters, two of whom we hear from in the first person, while the third character we see only in the close third person. When you're deciding on the point of view of your story, however, you're not just deciding who tells it. There's also the question of to whom the writer is telling the story, as well as the question of the time and distance from which a story is told. Let's take these one at a time. When I say that you have to consider to whom a story is told, I'm not talking about trying to decide who your audience is. That's a different question, and not necessarily an artistic one. Rather, I'm talking about a different question. Is your narration addressed to an unknown reader in the real world, or is it addressed to some one person or some group of people who exist in the world of the story? Take, for example, three of the most famous first-person narratives in literary history: Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and Nabokov's Lolita. In the first two examples, the narrator is the title character. In Lolita, the narrator is the poet Humbert Humbert, and the title character is the 12-year-old girl who is the object of his sexual obsession. In all three examples, there are at least hints that the character is aware that he or she is addressing the actual reader of the book. Jane Eyre narrates her own story with great force and intimacy, as if she were writing her memoir for posterity. In the novel's single most famous line, she makes it clear that she knows she's writing a book when she says about Mr. Rochester, "Reader, I married him." Here you have one of the most memorable examples of a fictional character speaking directly to the real readers of her book, or seeming to. What's really happening, of course, is that Charlotte Bronte, a real person, is causing Jane Eyre, a fictional person, to speak directly to the reader. Or, if you prefer a more mystical interpretation, Jane Eyre is speaking through Charlotte Bronte. Huck Finn bridges the gap between fiction and reality in his very first sentence. You don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. In this case, a fictional character not only speaks directly to the reader, he refers to a real book by the real author in which he, Huck, first appears as a fictional character. Again, of course, it's not really Huck, but Mark Twain, using Huck to refer to himself and his own earlier book. In Lolita, Humbert Humbert's first-person narrative is a little less philosophically complex. The book opens with an introduction by a fictional psychiatrist, and the rest of the novel is written as a confession of his crimes that Humbert Humbert wrote in prison. Unlike Jane Eyre and Huck Finn, who cross the divide between the fictional world and the real world, Humbert Humbert remains constrained within the pages of his book. He knows he's writing something that may only ever be read by the authorities who locked him away. The question of a book's intended reader gets even more complicated when you consider first-person narrators who speak in the present tense. We often find this kind of narration in thrillers. I walk into the room and pull my gun, that sort of thing. Such a narration contributes to the pace and immediacy of an exciting story, but there's something fundamentally improbable about it. Are we to understand that the character is silently narrating what he's doing as he does it? And then there are the first-person narrators of historical novels. Robert Graves' I, Claudius and Marguerite Yourcenar's Memoirs of Hadrian are fictional memoirs by real Roman emperors. We are meant to believe that Claudius and Hadrian are speaking explicitly to posterity, to readers who may live centuries after the author himself has died. The uses of the third person can be just as diverse. The 19th century third-person omniscient voice of George Eliot and Leo Tolstoy is very much a public, authoritative voice. While you wouldn't mistake Eliot or Tolstoy for each other, they share a certain godlike distance from the story and their characters. The voice of Dickens, however, is more feverish and engaged in the lives of his characters, even though he also often writes in the third person. There are also third-person narrations that presume the reader's intimacy with the social setting and the worldview of the author. Take, for example, the famous first line of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Now, Austen was an ironic writer, so presumably even she understood the hyperbole of this statement. Outside of early 19th century Britain, and a very narrow slice of British society at that, this is patently not a universal truth. But even if you don't believe it, The first sentence implicates the reader in Austen's world right from the very first words. Moving into the 20th century, you have the stream of consciousness third person of such books as Mrs. Dalloway. Much of that book doesn't feel as though it's speaking to anyone outside of Mrs. Dalloway's head, let alone outside of the novel. Even though the novel is technically in the third person, the effect of reading Mrs. Dalloway's narrative voice is like eavesdropping on a character's thoughts in real time. With a first-person narrator, you have to decide just how close the narrator is to the events he or she is describing. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is told mainly in the past tense, but that famous opening sentence is told in the present tense. You don't know about me without you have read a book called The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. The clear implication of Huck's particular voice throughout the book is that he, the narrator, is still a boy, and he is telling us about a series of events that happened very recently. In other words, it's a story about a child told by the child. He's telling us about more or less contemporary events. It is a past tense story told by a present tense narrator, or a narrator who is speaking to us as we're reading. You get a slightly different effect from Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. The narrator of that novel is Scout, who was a child during the events of the novel, but who is remembering them from the perspective of an adult. At times, her narration is immediate and limited to what she knew when the events were actually happening. At other times, the novel steps back and narrates the events from the point of view of a grown woman, looking back on her childhood. In this respect, you might say we get the best of both worlds. A child's eye view of childhood, leavened with an adult's perspective on the events that the young Scout would not have fully understood. It's a very subtle and sophisticated use of voice, and one of the elements of the book that accounts for its continuing popularity. In Marilynne Robinson's Housekeeping, the narrator announces herself in the first person, present tense, in the book's first line, "My name is Ruth." But the rest of the book is told in a retrospective past tense. Even more so than Scout in To Kill a Mockingbird, Ruth is clearly telling the story from the point of view of a grown woman, at a distance of many years. And in Thomas Berger's epic western Little Big Man, the narrator, Jack Crabb, speaks about events that happened a lifetime ago, including his friendship with Wild Bill Hickok, his days as a gunfighter, and his life among the Sioux. This gives his narration the quality of a tall tale. Among other things, Jack Crabb claims to be the only white survivor of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and it helps define Jack himself as a talkative old man who loves spinning yarns. The idea of a narration's temporal distance from the events in the narrative is just as important with third-person narratives. The past tense is the default tense of many novels and stories, but the use of the past tense doesn't necessarily mean the events of the story took place in the distant past. For example, Tolstoy's Anna Karenina is told in the past tense, but it was both written and set during the 1870s. George Eliot's Middlemarch, on the other hand, was published in the early 1870s, but it was set 40 years earlier, in the 1830s. Tolstoy is using the past tense to tell a contemporary story, while Eliot is using a similar past tense to tell a story of the recent past, giving the reader some distance from the events. If you transfer this difference to the present day, you can see that one use of the past tense is significantly different from the other. Consider the difference between watching the two television shows Breaking Bad and Mad Men. Breaking Bad is set more or less in the present moment, forcing the viewer to confront the fact that Walter White's desperation and increasingly bad behavior are a result of a way of life in which we all participate. Mad Men, on the other hand, is set half a century in the past. This distance allows the viewer to look back on Don Draper's lies and infidelities with the smugness of hindsight. Breaking Bad jangles our nerves because there's no temporal distance between the story and us. This is how we live now. But with Mad Men, we can at least cling to the illusion that we are better behaved than the people who worked on Madison Avenue in the early 1960s. So, as if choosing among all the myriad possibilities for creating character and sketching out a plot weren't complicated enough, you have to contend with all the complicated choices that come with deciding what point of view to use and which voice to use. Do you want to survey the landscape from a great height? Do you want to try and encompass as wide a view as possible, showing the whole scope of society while diving at will into the heads of a variety of characters? Or do you only want to look at that little patch of territory you can see at ground level, from the point of view of a single character? Do you want to adopt the godlike authority of a third-person past-tense narration that sees and understands all? Or do you want a first-person past-tense narrator who can look back with more experience on her younger self? Or do you want a third-person present-tense narration that relates events as they happen with no hint of what's coming? It's a lot to think about, so here's an exercise that might help you sort things out. Take the opening of any of the books I talked about in this lecture, or the opening of a book of your own choosing, or the opening of something you've written yourself, and try it in a different point of view, a different verb tense, a different voice. Would Huck Finn work if it were narrated in the third person? What if it were narrated by an elderly Huck looking back on his childhood? Would George Eliot be able to create as broad a portrait of the community in Middlemarch if it were narrated by only one character within the story? What would I, Claudius, feel like if it was written in the present tense? Would it make the Roman emperor's court feel more immediate, or would it just feel bizarre? I don't know if these alternate versions would be better or worse, but they would certainly be different than the ones we know. In the next lecture, I'll take a more detailed look at the first person, and I'll be talking again about Ishmael in Moby Dick and Nick Carraway in The Great Gatsby. But I'll also be talking about unreliable narrators in the works of Henry James, Eudora Welty, and Mohsin Hamid. Then, in the following lecture, we'll look at the varieties of the third person. Each of these points of view has its advantages and disadvantages, and by exploring their use in the work of other authors, you'll be able to think about how to use different types of point of view and voice in your own work. There is something inherently improbable about a first-person narrator. How often in real life have you ever listened to someone tell you a story about themselves that included not only their thoughts and actions, but elaborate evocations of the setting, not to mention verbatim dialogue from other people? Not very often, I'm guessing. As I said in my lecture about evocation, most people in real life tell stories the way they tell jokes, with just enough detail to get the point across. But in fiction, first-person narrators often pay attention to the purely literary requirements of setting a scene. They evoke sights and sounds and feelings, and they vividly render other characters. And if that narrator is in a novel, the first person becomes even more improbable, because the narrator is likely to go on without interruption for 100,000 words. In case you're wondering, that would take about 12 hours to speak aloud. In the preface to one of his novels, the American writer Henry James summed up the inherent improbability of the first-person narration when he said how strange it was to make a narrator both hero and historian of his own story. In other words, a first-person narration is peculiar because it has to do two things at once. It has to tell the story, but it also has to evoke one of the story's characters. And in many cases, the narrator is the story's most important character. What can make it even more peculiar is the fact that the narrator and the author don't always see eye to eye. As we'll see, this can lead to some interesting results. But in spite of its fundamental weirdness, or maybe even because of it, a first-person narration can be one of the most intimate, seductive, and natural-seeming ways to tell a story if it's done well. Certain varieties of third-person narration have an authoritative public voice. Think of George Eliot or Tolstoy, which can make you feel as if you're being lectured to as part of a large audience. But a first-person narrator can feel as if he or she is speaking to you alone, confiding his or her story to you and to no one else. This is what happened to me, the narrator is telling you. I saw this with my own eyes. A first-person narration can offer the reader the same feeling of immediacy and truthfulness we get when we hear testimony in a court case, read an intimate memoir, or, God forbid, sneak a peek at someone else's diary. And because a fictional character has the potential to reveal more of him or herself than any real person possibly could, a first-person narration can offer you an experience that you usually can't get in real life. This intimacy accounts for the deep affection we feel for certain famous fictional narrators. Consider how badly we want Jane Eyre to come up trumps and marry Mr. Rochester. Consider how much we want Huckleberry Finn to do the right thing and help the slave Jim gain his freedom. And consider how many people love J.D. Salinger's Holden Caulfield for his bluntness and his smart alecky wit. But even so, this intimacy is still not real. A first-person narrator is an arbitrary literary conceit that is mutually agreed upon by the writer and the reader. It creates an illusion of intimacy that requires, on the part of the writer, fidelity to the voice of the narrator, not only as the source of the story, but as a character within the story. On the part of the reader, this illusion of intimacy requires a willingness to go along with the fantasy that this fictional person is real and telling you the truth. On the one hand, you have the inherent improbability of hearing a complex story told to you by one of its participants, and, on the other, you have the illicit thrill of hearing something that no one else knows. The tension between these two factors accounts for much of the power and the mystery of the first person. In this lecture, I want to look at several different varieties of first-person narrator and talk about how you can use each of them. Let's start with the least intimate variety. In the previous lecture, I called this the objective first person, or the first-person narrator as recording I. This is a narrator who is present in the story, but who is not the most important character. In the continuum of points of view, an objective first-person narrator is about halfway between the close third person and a more intimate first person. The narrator's role in telling the story is more important than his or her role in creating character. The most obvious examples from American literature are Ishmael in Moby Dick and Nick Carraway in The Great Gatsby. Ishmael, of course, introduces himself to the reader in the very first line of the novel, "Call me Ishmael," and early in the book we hear a great deal about his experiences. But it becomes obvious pretty quickly that the book is more about Captain Ahab than it is about anyone else. As it turns out, not only is Ahab more interesting than Ishmael, most of the characters in the book are more interesting than Ishmael. In fact, one of the curious things about Moby Dick is that its first-person narrator simply disappears for pages at a time. There are scenes in the novel where Ishmael isn't even present. For example, there's a scene between Ahab and his first mate, Starbuck, which takes place when they are alone in Ahab's cabin, and which is therefore written in a de facto third person. What's more, Ishmael doesn't develop in the way that characters in modern novels often do. He goes through some tremendous experiences, including the sinking of his ship and the death of everyone else in the story. But in the end, he's essentially the same person as he was at the beginning. There are no epiphanies for Ishmael. In The Great Gatsby, Nick Carraway takes much more of a role in the story than Ishmael does in Moby Dick. Nick is Daisy's cousin, his house is the site of Gatsby and Daisy's reunion, and he's present for many of the big scenes. But on the whole, he serves mainly as the recording eye for the story. Unlike the other major characters, Gatsby, Daisy, and Daisy's husband Tom, Nick has to work for a living, which makes him an outsider to the world he's depicting. He is able to record the story of the stinking rich characters around him with more objectivity and distance than Gatsby or Daisy could. Nick is certainly more engaged in the story than Ishmael is in Moby Dick, so the novel's famous last line, "So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past," represents Nick's epiphany and no one else's. But even so, he's still not essential to the playing out of the plot. He gives an intimate portrait of a man he knew personally, but from a slight remove. This, I think, is the hallmark of the slightly remote first-person narrator. He is not quite as remote as the third person, and not quite as intimate as a more active first-person narrator. This kind of narrator allows you to feel you are witnessing the events of the novel firsthand, but with no pressure from the narrator to endorse a particular opinion of any of the characters or any of the actions in the story. A version of Moby Dick narrated by Ahab, or a version of The Great Gatsby narrated by Jay Gatsby, would require us to take sides for or against our narrator, which I personally think would have diminished the power of these two novels. So perhaps the objective and remote first-person narrator is especially effective when your central character is both charismatic and slippery, the way Ahab and Gatsby are. Ishmael and Nick Carraway allow us to get close, but not too close. Now let's talk about what I called in my previous lecture the subjective first person, and let's break it down into several different varieties. The first variety is what I'm going to call the heroic narrator. This sort of narrator is usually the main character, or at least one of the main characters, and she takes an active role in the events of the story. In this case, the narration's evocation of her own character is equally important to telling the story. This sort of narrator has something in common with the objective first-person narrator. In both cases, the reader is invited to take the narrator at face value and assume that what she is telling you is the truth. But heroic narration takes this assumption a bit further and invites the reader to actively endorse the narrator's judgments of the other characters and situations in the story. We don't root for Nick Carraway in The Great Gatsby because he's not the main character. Nick's slight remove from the action enables us to make up our own mind about Gatsby himself. But in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, we are asked not only to assume that Jane is telling the truth throughout, but we are also actively encouraged to endorse Jane's judgments of the other characters and to root for her. In the book's wonderful first paragraph, which I quoted in an earlier lecture, we are encouraged to feel Jane's righteous anger at her mistreatment by her foster family. Later on, we are encouraged to sympathize with her feeling of betrayal when she discovers that Mr. Rochester is already married. And at the end, we are encouraged to feel her joy and triumph when she is finally able to marry him. Let me put this another way. In a story with a heroic narrator, there is not much difference between the narrator's opinion of the other characters and the author's. In some cases, and in some very good books, this can become a kind of wish fulfillment. For example, consider Philip Marlowe, the hard-boiled private investigator who is the main character and the narrator of the great detective stories of Raymond Chandler. At first glance, it might seem as if Marlowe is an objective first-person narrator, simply recording what he sees and hears. Listen to the first paragraph of Chandler's novel, The Long Goodbye. The first time I laid eyes on Terry Lennox, he was drunk in a Rolls-Royce Silver Wraith outside the Terrace of the Dancers. The parking lot attendant had brought the car out and he was still holding the door open because Terry Lennox's left foot was still dangling outside, as if he had forgotten he had one. He had a young-looking face, but his hair was bone white. You could tell by his eyes that he was plastered to the hairline, but otherwise he looked like any other nice young guy who had been spending too much money in a joint that existed for that purpose and for no other. At first, this seems to be an objective bit of description that happens to be written in the first person. But if you listen carefully to Marlowe's voice, you realize that the narrator is passing judgment. Marlowe's voice is that of a cool, slightly weary man of the world. You can tell by listening to him that he has a lot of experience with people of all sorts, and that he can recognize when a man is drunk just by looking at his eyes. The kicker is the last part of the last sentence. Marlowe refers to the nightclub The Dancers not just as a joint, but as the sort of joint that exists for no other reason than to take money off nice young guys like Terry Lennox. This is a judgment. It tells us that Marlowe, and by proxy Chandler himself, accepts that he has to live in this crummy world, but he doesn't have to approve of it. As Marlowe moves through the rest of the novel, most of the story is about other people, but on every page, Marlowe continues to crack wise and make sharp judgments of everything and everybody around him. He makes mistakes, of course, but he usually recovers from them later on. And in nearly every scene, Marlowe is the one in control, the one who understands what's really going on, and the one who gets off the best jokes. The distance between Philip Marlowe's view of the world and Raymond Chandler's is not very great. This kind of wish-fulfilling narration allows both the reader and the author to live through the narrator without any guilt or second thoughts. It allows us to move through an exciting story full of danger and intrigue as the coolest, smartest, and most righteous person in the room. Now let's take a look at a more complex version of the heroic first person. Let's return to one of the most famous narrators in literary history, namely Huck Finn in Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Huck is not only a superbly entertaining narrator, he's one of the great characters in American fiction. He is a plain-spoken, semi-literate, but verbally inventive boy who is by turns gullible and devious, resourceful and accident-prone, and who gets by on what today we would call street smarts. In fact, Huck implicitly warns the reader in the very first paragraph that not all of what follows may be true. What he says is, "I never seen anybody but lied one time or another." And indeed, throughout the book, Huck repeatedly uses lies to get himself out of trouble. Let's look at the ways in which Huck is a more complex narrator than Philip Marlowe. While Marlowe's narration certainly uses the slang and idioms of mid-20th century urban America, Huck's dialect is even more specific, representing rural Missouri in the years before the Civil War. Indeed, one of the greatest pleasures of reading the book is just being able to listen to the cadences, rhythms, and rich idioms of Huck's speech. But the more important reason that Huck is a more interesting narrator is that his boyish, semi-educated view of the world does not necessarily represent the views of his author. Huck is shrewd, wily, and fundamentally decent, but he's also young and immature and badly educated. His creator, however, is much more mature and better educated. The result is that Huck represents a classic example of what you might call the double consciousness of a first-person narrator. This is when a skilled writer evokes the beliefs and prejudices of his narrator, while at the same time letting the reader see through the narration to what's really going on. This double consciousness accounts for much of the humor in Huckleberry Finn. Some of the best passages are Huck's guileless descriptions of adult behavior that he doesn't understand. One such moment comes in Chapter 1, when the widow Douglas, one of the prim and proper adults in Huck's life, tries to read to him from the Bible. After supper, she got out her book and learned me about Moses and the bulrushers, and I was in a sweat to find out all about him. But by and by, she let it out that Moses had been dead a considerable long time. So then I didn't care no more about him, because I don't take no stock in dead people. Now, the humor in this passage comes from the double consciousness of the narration. On the one hand, we understand and maybe even sympathize with the boredom of a child who is being told a long, involved story about some old dead guy. On the other hand, Mark Twain is winking at us over Huck's shoulder, letting us know that he knows as well as we do that Huck is missing the point. More importantly, though, the double consciousness of Huckleberry Finn explicitly manifests itself at the moral climax of the book in Chapter 31. This is the moment when Huck has to decide whether to allow his friend, the slave Jim, to be sold back into slavery, or whether he should help Jim go free. Everything about the moral code of Huck's world, everything ever told to him by white teachers, ministers, and other authority figures, tells him that letting a slave run away is a kind of theft. Huck truly believes that sanctioning this theft will send him to hell. But then, in a heartfelt paragraph, he recalls fondly the way he and Jim looked after each other as they floated down the river. Finally, he says, in one of the most famous sentences in American literature, "All right then, I'll go to hell." Then he says, "It was awful thoughts and awful words, but they was said, and I let them stay said, and never thought no more about reforming. I shoved the whole thing out of my head and said I would take up wickedness again, which was in my line, being brung up to it, and the other weren't. And for a starter, I would go to work and steal Jim out of slavery again. And if I could think up anything worse, I would do that too, because as long as I was in, and in for good, I might as well go the whole hog." There are three things, at least, going on in this thrilling paragraph. One is that Huck is simply telling us the story of his decision. Another is that Twain is allowing us to revel in the sheer pleasure of hearing Huck reason this out for himself in his own unique voice. But the most important thing is that Twain is peeking through his own character at this point. Twain is letting the reader know that Huck is doing the right thing, even if Huck himself doesn't know it. Remember, at this point, Huck really thinks he's consigning himself to eternal damnation. On the one hand, Twain stays absolutely true to his character. Huck sounds like Huck all the way through the passage, with his rough grammar, his folksy idioms, and his phonetic spellings. But on the other hand, Twain allows the reader to see through Huck and to understand the larger issue, which is the immorality of slavery. Huck comes down on the side of love versus the letter of the law. And even though we, as readers, may fault his reasoning, we can't fault his conclusion. Using Huck's own voice, Mark Twain allows us to see Huck and the world he lives in even more clearly than Huck himself could. Now, the very last paragraph of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn makes it clear that Huck is still a boy when he narrates his own story, and that his adventures have happened only in the recent past. This brings me to the next variety of the heroic first person, which I'm going to call the retrospective narrator. One of the hallmarks of the retrospective narrator is that she is recalling events from her own life from a distance of many years. Unlike Huck Finn, she is looking back at herself when she was younger. But there's more to it than simply the distance in time. In this type of narration, the narrator is also expressing the emotional and intellectual distance between her younger self and the person she is now at the time she's narrating the story. There are many stories and books that fulfill the first requirement of this type of narration, but not the second. For example, Jane Eyre is looking back on her struggles as a young woman from the perspective of an older woman, happily married to Mr. Rochester, so her story fulfills the first requirement. But she doesn't really write very critically or objectively about herself as a younger woman. Remember, we're encouraged to root for Jane throughout the book, so her narration does not fulfill the second requirement. One of the best examples of the sort of narrator who does fulfill both requirements is the character Ruth in Marilynne Robinson's novel Housekeeping. Following in the footsteps of other classic American narrators such as Ishmael, Huck, and Nick Carraway, Ruth introduces herself directly to the reader in the first sentence, "My name is Ruth." Then, with characteristically American directness, she goes on to summarize her backstory in a few words. "I grew up with my younger sister Lucille under the care of my grandmother, Mrs. Sylvia Foster, and when she died, of her sisters-in-law, Mrs. Lily and Nona Foster, and when they fled, of her daughter, Mrs. Sylvia Fisher." The majority of the book is about how Ruth and Lucille, two young girls who have been either abandoned or orphaned by all the other adults in their family, end up being looked after by Sylvia, their very unconventional aunt. Sylvia has lived her adult life drifting from town to town, but for the sake of her nieces, she makes an attempt to create some stability for them in the family home in a small town in Idaho. But try as she might, Sylvia finally can't resist the pull of a restless life. In the end, the young Ruth chooses to run off with her aunt, while Lucille chooses to stay behind and live a more conventional life. The simplicity of this belies the dreamlike strangeness of this novel. It is told many years later by the grown-up Ruth, who is now a vastly different person from the young girl she had been. Unlike Jane Eyre, who starts as an outsider and achieves the conventional goals of marriage, security, and children, Ruth chooses, as Huck Finn puts it at the end of his book, to light out for the territory and live an unsettled life in the company of her strange aunt. In other words, Ruth is the opposite of Jane Eyre. She leaves a conventional life to become an outsider and writes her narrative from that perspective. She looks back on her childhood without regret or nostalgia, but instead with a kind of bemused, mysterious calm that passes no judgment. Written in limpid, poetic prose, Ruth's narration takes the reader on a spiritual journey that requires the reader to question the conventional wisdom about family life, about motherhood, and about the relations between sisters. Ruth's voice truly puts us in the head of someone very, very unusual. Her narration allows us to see a way of living we may not want to inhabit in real life, but which has the profound effect of showing us the world in a whole new light. There is also another kind of retrospective first-person narrator, namely one who looks back on his former self with disappointment or even contempt. In an earlier lecture, I talked about James Baldwin's novel Giovanni's Room, which is narrated by an American expatriate in Paris named David. As you may recall, David struggles with his sexuality throughout this brief novel. He is powerfully attracted to men, but he loves and hopes to marry a young American woman named Hella. The bulk of the story is about David's intense affair with a bartender named Giovanni. David lives with the man for a time, but he eventually leaves Giovanni in favor of Hella. David's rejection of Giovanni leads indirectly to Giovanni's murder of a bar owner and his execution. At the end of the book, Hella leaves David as well. Finally, David, in a last moment of cowardice, decides not to attend Giovanni's execution. David's narration is not told at a great distance in time from the events of the story. It is suffused throughout with David's mixed emotions about being gay, but most of all, his narration is dominated by his self-contempt for the way he treated Giovanni. As early as the end of the second chapter, David considers the fact that Giovanni will be rotting soon in unhallowed ground, and then he says, "Until I die, there will be those moments seeming to rise up out of the ground like Macbeth's witches, when his face will come before me, that face in all its changes, when the exact timbre of his voice and the tricks of his speech will nearly scorch my ears, when his smell will overpower my nostrils." In fact, you might say that David is an anti-heroic narrator, but he still has something in common with a heroic narrator. In Jane Eyre, we are expected to take Jane's judgments of herself and the other characters at face value. By the same token, we are meant to take David's story at face value and to endorse his judgment of himself. It's just that in his case, we are meant to share his contempt for himself rather than endorse his heroism. This brings us to the unreliable narrator, or the sort of narrator who cannot be trusted by the reader. Unreliable first-person narrators come in several varieties. The simplest version is the narrator who is simply lying to the reader and who reveals his lies at the end. John Banville's novel Dr. Copernicus is a fictional account of the life of the famous astronomer. Most of the book is told in the close third person, from Copernicus's point of view, but there is a fascinating section written in the first person by a scholar named Rheticus. This young scholar was a student of Copernicus, who, in the manner of ambitious students of famous teachers, is full of rage at Copernicus for all sorts of reasons. His chapter is full of pernicious gossip and severe criticisms of the older man. Only at the end of his section does Rheticus confess that a crucial element in his story was invented, which casts into doubt nearly everything else he said for the previous 60 pages. There is another kind of unreliable narrator, namely the one who lies to other characters in the story and often ends up deluding himself. The unnamed first-person narrator of Henry James's novella, The Aspern Papers, is a literary critic who is desperate to acquire some old love letters by a long-dead American poet named Jeffrey Aspern. These letters are in the possession of Aspern's former lover, now a very old woman. The narrator attempts to get the papers away from her by pretending to be romantically interested in the old woman's unattractive niece. It all goes wrong, of course. The critic's scam is discovered, and on the final page, the niece, who at last understands the game he was playing, tells the narrator she's burned the letters. Throughout the novella, the narrator has wrestled with his conscience, but in the end, he stifles it. In the very last line of the story, when he looks at a picture of the poet that hangs in his study, he says, "When I look at it, I can scarcely bear my loss. I mean of the precious papers." Notice he says the loss of the papers, not the loss of his honor, his dignity, or any compassion for a lonely woman whose heart he broke. There is yet another sort of unreliable narrator, one who manages to delude both herself and the reader. The experience of reading Eudora Welty's hilarious story, Why I Live at the P.O., is like being cornered by a talkative and slightly unhinged woman. This narrator believes she has been wronged by her family and is determined to tell you her side of the story, whether you want to hear it or not. Here's the first paragraph. "I was getting along fine with Mama, Papa Daddy, and Uncle Rondo until my sister Stella Rondo just separated from her husband and came back home again. Mr. Whitaker, Of course I went with Mr. Whitaker first when he first appeared in China Grove, taking pose-yourself photos, and Stella Rondo broke us up. Told him I was one-sided, bigger on one side than the other, which is a deliberate, calculated falsehood. I'm the same. Stella Rondo is exactly 12 months to the day younger than I am, and for that reason, she's spoiled. And it just gets weirder and funnier from there. And it ends with the narrator explaining why she moved out of the family home and started living at the local post office. Much of the effect of the story comes from the way it mimics the cadences of someone who is telling you a story in person. Much of it is in the present tense, with dialogue in the manner of, so I says to her, and then, so she says to me, and so on. Because of the narrator's self-evident self-pity and her unconscious comic exaggeration, it's clear by the end of the story that her version of events is extremely biased, if not flat-out untrue. Unlike Rheticus, however, who admits at the end of his story that he has lied to the reader, Welty's narrator sticks to her guns right to the end. And if Stella Rondo should come to me this minute on bended knees and attempt to explain the incidents of her life with Mr. Whitaker, I'd simply put my fingers in both my ears and refuse to listen. Once again, as with Mark Twain and Huck Finn, we have a narration with a double consciousness. On the one hand, there's the narrator pleading her case with the reader unconvincingly, and on the other, there's Eudora Welty winking at us over her narrator's shoulder. Yet another version of the unreliable narrator is the narrator who may or may not be unreliable, but whose truthfulness is never finally revealed to the reader. One of the most interesting recent examples is the Pakistani writer Mohsin Hamid's The Reluctant Fundamentalist. This novel is told in the first person by a Pakistani man who attended Princeton and who worked on Wall Street, but who, after the events of 9/11, has found himself in reluctant sympathy with the goals of the terrorists. The novel is framed as a long monologue delivered in a cafe in the city of Lahore, as the unnamed narrator tells his life story to an American listener who never speaks. There are increasing hints throughout the book that the narrator may possibly be a terrorist himself. There are also hints that his listener may possibly be an American intelligence agent sent to kill him. The potential unreliability of the narrator is essential to the final impact of this very unsettling and thought-provoking book, and it could only have been done in the first person. In the next lecture, we'll look at a variety of things you can do with the third-person voice, and we'll be talking about how it's used in George Eliot's Middlemarch, George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, and George Pelecanos' detectives novel, The Cut. In the meantime, you might want to experiment with the first-person voice by attempting either the double consciousness that Twain uses in Huckleberry Finn or the unreliable narrator technique used by Eudora Welty or Mohsin Hamid. In the first instance, pick a character whose worldview you disagree with and write in their voice while trying to let your own worldview peek through. In the second instance, write from the point of view of a character who is clearly lying about something. Try to stay faithful to the character's voice while also letting the reader know that what the narrator is saying is not necessarily true. Writing in the first person can be a tricky thing to pull off, but when it's done well, and the reader finds herself caught up in the story as well as the voice, it can be one of the most satisfying experiences a writer and reader can share. It's not like I've done a survey or anything, but I think it's safe to say that some version of the third person is the default narrative voice of most contemporary fiction. With the rise of the memoir in recent years, the first person has given the third person a run for its money. But on the whole, most writers probably feel most comfortable writing in the third person. Why should this be, I wonder? As I said at the beginning of the previous lecture, a first-person narration can seem more natural, and it can certainly be appealing, intimate, and immediate, providing the illusion that we are hearing the events of the story from one of its participants, or at least from a witness. But as I also pointed out, first-person narrators can be deluded, or they can be liars. There is also another drawback which is common to nearly all first-person narrators, whether they're telling the truth or not. A first-person narrator can usually talk only about the events that he or she has witnessed or has heard about from another source. In addition, the first-person narration can be tricky for a writer because of that double consciousness that I explained in the last lecture. You have a slightly more complicated job when you're writing in the first person. You are not only telling the story, you are also creating an important character at the same time and telling the story through that character's voice. The third person, on the other hand, has a good deal more range and flexibility than the first person. A third-person narration can encompass all sorts of things that a first-person narrator wouldn't know or be able to express. The third person can also, paradoxically, go deeper into an individual character's consciousness than the first person can. If you adopt the godlike perspective of the omniscient third person, for example, every facet of a character's personality and history is made available to the reader. But perhaps most importantly, the third person is probably a more instinctive and natural way to tell a fictional story, especially if you're telling a story about someone who isn't yourself, as most fiction writers are. Most of us tell jokes in the third person. Nearly all fairy tales and folk tales are told in the third person. No one says, "Once upon a time, I went into the woods to my grandmother's house." And many of the great early texts of Western literature are told in the third person, from the Iliad and the Odyssey to Beowulf and Don Quixote. In its most straightforward form, the third person adopts the easy cadence and authority of the traditional oral storyteller. But of course, there are different varieties and flavors of the third person. Think back to my metaphor of the sky from my first lecture about point of view. I started at the zenith with the most omniscient variety of the third person and worked my way down the curve of the sky to the interior version of the first person on the ground level. In this lecture, we're going to look at the varieties of the third person in more detail. I will start with the type of third-person narration that is most like the first person and work my way back up to the godlike third person of the great 19th century novelists. What we'll find by the end, spoiler alert, is that most writers usually adopt more than one variety of the third person in the same story or novel. This is different from the way writers tend to use the first person, where you are often locked into one version of the narration throughout the entire story. So, let's start with the close third person, or what is sometimes called free indirect discourse. At the start of this lecture, I said that the third person is the default mode of most contemporary fiction, and the close third person is the type that is most commonly used. In the close third person, you adopt the point of view of only one character at a time, while continuing to use the third-person pronouns he or she. It's very similar to the first person on the whole, because the close third person sticks to what the character knows. It shows us only what that character has seen or heard about, and it shows us only that character's thoughts and feelings. In fact, the close third person traffics in that same double consciousness that the first person does, only with more weight being given to the exterior point of view of the author. In some instances, this kind of third person is so close to the character that it ends up being a de facto first person. In fact, in some uses of the close third person, you could probably switch the narrative into the first person without having to change too much apart from the pronouns. But that's rare. In most cases, the close third person at least contains the possibility of going deeper into the character's head than a simple first-person narration does. This is because the third person allows you to reveal things about the character's thoughts, feelings, intentions, and prejudices that the character himself may not know or understand. A close third person can also reveal the character's secrets. In this respect, the close third person can be more comprehensive than the first person. It allows you to show everything about a character and not just what the character chooses to reveal. As with any other choice in creative writing, choosing to use this particular point of view means you gain some things and you lose some things. In the first person, you can create a unique voice for the character, the way Twain does for Huck Finn. By choosing to tell the story in the close third person, you lose that distinctive voice. On the other hand, in the close third person, you can dive as deeply into your character's head as Virginia Woolf does in Mrs. Dalloway. Let's take a look at the difference. That moment in Huckleberry Finn where Huck decides to help Jim win his freedom would not be nearly as thrilling in the close third person. The power of that scene comes from watching Huck work it out for himself. If you were to change that passage into the third person, you'd have to pepper it with a lot of phrases like, Huck thought that, or it seemed to Huck that. And right there, you lose the immediacy of it. You lose the feeling that you're watching Huck Finn himself wrestling with his own conscience. At last, Huck decided, all right then, he'd go to hell, is not nearly as powerful a sentence as Huck himself saying, all right then, I'll go to hell. Now think back to that moment in Mrs. Dalloway that I mentioned in an earlier lecture, when Clarissa Dalloway is looking at a shop window. In just a few words, her mind skips with lightning speed from a memory of her father buying suits, to a shop where you could buy perfect gloves, to her uncle saying that you could know a lady by her gloves, to the death of her uncle during the war, to her own passion for gloves, and finally to her remote relationship with her daughter. It's possible to imagine recasting that scene in the first person, but think how clumsy it would be. As I stared in the window of a shop where you used to be able to buy almost perfect gloves, I was reminded of my Uncle William saying that you could know a lady by her shoes and gloves, which reminded me of how he turned over in his bed one morning and died, and so on. Not only is this horribly awkward, it actually changes Mrs. Dalloway as a character. It makes her a much more introspective and self-aware woman than she is in Woolf's version. It presumes that she understands her own thoughts as well as her author does. Instead, by using a very close, very intimate third person in that scene, we're getting an unself-conscious view of Clarissa Dalloway. We're seeing her intimately, but remotely at the same time. We understand her even better than she could understand herself. Let me put it this way. The close third person is like eavesdropping. We're more likely to believe what a politician says when he doesn't know the microphone is on than when he's wearing his public face and repeating his talking points. The close third person is like an open mic. It lays bare the private Mrs. Dalloway, not just the version of herself that she wants the world to see. Another reason the close third person is more flexible and comprehensive than the first person is that it's easier to shift point of view from one character to another. It's certainly possible to switch from one first-person narrator to another within the same story or book. William Faulkner does it brilliantly in As I Lay Dying, which is narrated by 15 different characters. It's a remarkable achievement, but before you rush off to imitate it, consider this. When you're writing in the first person, you're not only telling the story, you're creating an individual voice for that character. In Faulkner's case, that's 15 different narrators. And even though they all come from the same family, or at least from the same community, they all have to sound at least a little bit different from each other. It's a lot of work, both for the writer and the reader, which is perhaps why this technique isn't used very often. On the other hand, in the close third person, you can switch from one character to another with relative ease, because you don't have to reinvent the voice of the narration itself each time you switch point of view. You can use the same authorial voice to evoke different characters. Mrs. Dalloway is a bravura example of this, of course, often switching point of view within a scene. However, in most instances, writers shift point of view from chapter to chapter. This technique broadens the scope of the story beyond what only one character can know. I learned this the hard way when I was writing my first published novel, The Wild Colonial Boy. That novel was a thriller about a young Irish-American named Brian, who agrees to carry some explosives into Britain for an Irish terrorist. My first 3 drafts were in the close third person from Brian's point of view. The problem was that in each successive draft, the plot became more complicated. It reached a point where many of the most dramatic moments, a gunfight, a brutal interrogation, a terrorist bombing, happened when Brian wasn't present. This was supposed to be a thriller, and yet the most thrilling scenes entered the novel only as second-hand accounts or news reports. Finally, a friendly agent who agreed to read the third draft suggested that I tell the novel from the alternating points of view of Brian and several other characters in the novel. That way I could show the reader each dramatic moment from the point of view of one of the characters who was actually present, instead of just feebly telling the reader about them later on from Brian's second-hand perspective. This suggestion opened up the book, gave it a much wider scope, and made it much more thrilling. It also forced me to get inside the heads of 3 more characters, 2 of whom were women, which was something I might never have attempted on my own. And so I learned that alternating points of view in the close third person is a really powerful way to tell a long story or a novel. It gives you the best of both worlds. Each individual chapter allows you to inhabit the mind of a single character, but by changing the point of view with each subsequent chapter, you can broaden the scope of your narrative. In fact, by using several different point of view characters, you can show different perspectives on the same event. And at the most mechanical level, you can make sure the reader is present at all the most important scenes. Switching between several point of view characters with the close third person is an especially useful technique for very long, epic narratives. It can balance intimacy with a sort of widescreen cinematic expansiveness. George R.R. Martin uses this technique very effectively in his Song of Ice and Fire novels. Each book is told from the points of view of many different characters, and the point of view switches with each chapter. Not only does this allow the reader to see the complex events of the story from multiple points of view, it allows Martin to evoke a vast imaginary world in vivid and evocative detail. And by showing different and often competing perspectives on the same series of events, the series reads less like a simplistic fable of good versus evil, and more like a gritty contemporary account of conflicting interests. Martin also does something else that many writers do when using the close third person. He includes the point of view character's thoughts in the first person, but within the third person narration. Usually these thoughts are set off from the rest of the narration by italics. Here's the character Jaime Lannister, as he's being ferried down a river in a rowboat as a captive in chains, and he's trying to catch a little sleep on the fly. He must have drifted off. The wine had made him sleepy, and it felt good to stretch, a luxury his chains had not permitted him in his cell. Jaime had long ago learned to snatch sleep in the saddle during a march. This was no harder. Then, in italics, Tyrion is going to laugh himself sick when he hears how I slept through my own escape. Then, back to Roman type. He was awake now, though, and the fetters were irksome. When it's done seamlessly, as it is here, this can add yet another dimension to the close third person. And some writers, such as Leo Tolstoy and Anna Karenina, set their characters' thoughts in quotation marks rather than italics, using she thought or she said to herself, rather than the usual dialogue tag, she said. Other writers incorporate the first-person thoughts of a character without using italics or quotation marks. The entirety of my novel, Next, is told from the close third-person point of view of a single character named Kevin. Before publication, I had a friendly disagreement with the copy editor, who wanted to put Kevin's first-person thoughts in italics. Because the whole book was essentially in Kevin's head, I was afraid that all those italics would simply be distracting, so I insisted on leaving his thoughts in Roman type. Now let's take a quick look at another variety of the third person, namely the objective or remote third person. This is the sort of third-person narration that simply describes what the characters do and say without giving the reader access to their thoughts. At first glance, this kind of narration might seem the same as the recording I first person I talked about in the last lecture, in which a character who is tangential to the main story tells the events of the narrative the way Ishmael and Nick Carraway do. But there's a crucial difference. With the recording I first person, the events are still being filtered through a fictional consciousness. And this fictional consciousness often passes judgment or makes educated guesses as to what the other characters are thinking. Nick Carraway may not be central to The Great Gatsby, but he does narrate the story of Gatsby and Daisy from a particular point of view. Nick's take on the events of the novel still colors the reader's understanding. Compare this with the remote third-person narration in Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon. This narrative perspective watches everything the characters do like a camera, but without giving us direct access to their thoughts and feelings. Here's a moment when Sam Spade is embracing his partner's wife. He's been carrying on an affair with her, and this excerpt comes from the moment when they have found out that his partner and her husband is dead. He grimaced again and bent his head for a surreptitious look at the watch on his wrist. His left arm was around her, the hand on her left shoulder. His cuff was pulled back far enough to leave the watch uncovered. It showed 10:10. The woman stirred in his arms and raised her face again. Her blue eyes were wet, round, and white-ringed. Her mouth was moist. "Oh, Sam," she moaned, "did you kill him?" Spade stared at her with bulging eyes. His bony jaw fell down. He took his arms from her and stepped back out of her arms. He scowled at her and cleared his throat. Now, it's pretty clear from this that Spade may be a heartless cad, but he's probably not a murderer. And since we don't know what he's actually thinking, we can't be absolutely certain. This kind of third person keeps us at arm's length from its characters. This builds suspense and keeps the reader on his toes, but at the cost of a certain coldness. The opposite of this remote and non-committal third person is what you might call the engaged or judgmental third person. Even though this variety of the third person is not tied to a character in the story, the voice still has a strong opinion about the events it is relating. You find this type of third person much more commonly in the novels of the 18th and 19th centuries, when authors had no problem passing judgment on the follies of their characters. There is no pretense of objectivity in the narrative voice, which passes judgment right and left without filtering it through a character. This kind of voice works especially well with comic or picaresque novels, like those of the 18th century English writer Henry Fielding. His big comic novel Tom Jones regularly passes judgment on the follies of its characters. A generation later, you still hear something of the same voice in Jane Austen, who was a much more subtle writer than Henry Fielding, but also a very sharp judge of flawed characters. Much of Pride and Prejudice is told in the close third person from Elizabeth Bennet's point of view, but there are also memorable passages in which the author herself passes a direct and unmediated judgment. Here's a paragraph from the first chapter, which sums up the badly mismatched marriage of Elizabeth's parents, even before we have met any of their daughters. Mr. Bennet was so odd a mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humor, reserve, and caprice that the experience of 23 years had been insufficient to make his wife understand his character. Her mind was less difficult to develop. She was a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. When she was discontented, she fancied herself nervous. The business of her life was to get her daughters married. Its solace was visiting and news. If this is a bit too 19th century for you, let me translate. Mr. Bennet is a quick-witted, intelligent man who keeps his opinions to himself and hides behind his sarcasm. Mrs. Bennet is uneducated and not very intelligent, and she loves gossip and is terrified that her daughters will not marry well. Jane Austen is telling us rather bluntly that this is not a match made in heaven. Perhaps the most enthusiastically judgmental narrator of all time is Charles Dickens. His third-person narration often has great fun at the expense of his characters, and it also doesn't shy away from stern moral outrage. In the opening pages of one of his greatest novels, Bleak House, Dickens is already passing judgment before he has introduced any characters at all, when he describes at length the baleful effect of a complicated Chancery Court lawsuit. Jarndyce and Jarndyce drones on. This scarecrow of a suit has, in the course of time, become so complicated that no man alive knows what it means. The parties to it understand it least, but it has been observed that no two chancery lawyers can talk about it for 5 minutes without coming to a total disagreement as to all the premises. Innumerable children have been born into the cause. Innumerable young people have married into it. Innumerable old people have died out of it. Scores of persons have deliriously found themselves made parties in Jarndyce and Jarndyce without knowing how or why. Whole families have inherited legendary hatreds with the suit. and so on. Dickens being Dickens, this goes on for several pages. Modern writers are no less opinionated than Dickens, of course, but they usually don't tell the reader what to think. Instead, most contemporary novelists prefer to stand back and let the events of the novel and the actions of the characters speak for themselves, often while discreetly stacking the deck. Still, there are some modern novelists, such as John Irving and Tom Wolfe, who sometimes use their third-person narrative voice to pass an overt judgment. Let's move now up to the zenith of my imaginary dome, to the omniscient third person. This is the magisterial point of view of the great 19th century novelists such as George Eliot and Leo Tolstoy. This version of the third person is often described as godlike, but not just because it allows the writer complete access to the world she has created and the inner lives of her characters. Every writer already has that power, of course, no matter what point of view she's using. The omniscient third person is called godlike, rather, because it presents the reader the full range of perspectives, from the most all-encompassing view of a community to the most intimate exchange between two individuals to a character's most private thoughts. The hallmark of this kind of third-person narration, especially in the hands of a great writer like George Eliot, is that it can swoop in a single chapter, and sometimes in a single passage, from the widest view of the story to the most intimate. A good example of this kind of narrative dexterity is Chapter 11 of Eliot's Middlemarch. This is a huge Victorian novel with a lot of characters and a lot of story to tell, and it's set in a small fictional English community called Middlemarch in the 1830s. The whole of Chapter 11 is about 3,500 words, and in the first 1,300 words, Eliot directly tells us about a doctor named Lydgate. Dr. Lydgate is new to the town, and he is interested in marrying a very pretty young woman named Rosamund Vincy. Over the course of the passage, Eliot tells us bluntly that Lydgate is young, poor, and ambitious. She also tells us that the chief quality he wants in a wife is beauty and charm, which is why he has already ruled out the novel's main character, Dorothea Brooke, because Dorothea is too brainy and serious. Eliot also simply tells us that Rosamund Vincy is likewise interested in Lydgate, because he is a handsome and accomplished outsider, and because she considers herself too good for the boring young men of Middlemarch. In this long passage of pure exposition, Eliot masterfully fits Lydgate and Rosamund within the social hierarchy of the town, and she also takes time to show how love and marriage can disarrange that social hierarchy. Her perspective in the first section of Chapter 11 is as godlike as possible. It is cool and even-handed and remote, with a few flashes of authorial judgment in the manner of Jane Austen or Henry Fielding. Then, in the second part of the chapter, Eliot deftly narrows her focus from the general to the particular. She focuses on the breakfast table conversation of Rosamund's family on a particular morning. We get to watch Rosamund, her brother Fred, and their mother bantering about Rosamund's marriage prospects, the rules of social class in their community, and Fred's opinion of Lydgate, among other things. It's one of my favorite scenes in all of literature, because Eliot does so many things at once, and does them so well. At the same time as she vividly evokes each individual character and shows their complicated relationships with each other, she also takes care of an important moment in the plot and gives the reader information that will be important later on. And it's all done in a third person that is halfway between a recording I and the more judgmental third person Eliot was using in the first half of the chapter. The only variety of the third person she doesn't use is the close third person, allowing us to see the scene strictly from inside the mind of Fred, Rosamund, or their mother. Eliot very effectively places us in the room with these characters. She allows us to witness each twist and turn of their conversation and to watch their body language. But with the reserve of the 19th century novelist, she does not encourage us to see through the eyes of any of the characters in the scene, or even to identify with any one of them. Which is not to say that an omniscient third-person narration can't incorporate the close third person as well. In Anna Karenina, which was published only a few years after Middlemarch, Tolstoy writes much of the novel in the same magisterial, omniscient third person that Eliot uses, and he keeps us at a slight remove from the characters. But at certain points in the novel, especially with Anna herself and with another character named Levin, he also delves into a close third person that seems very contemporary to a modern reader. In the famous climax of the book, when Anna rushes about Moscow in a panic before her fateful encounter with a locomotive, the novel delves deep into her mind, mixing her first-person thoughts with an extremely intimate close third person. The omniscient third person of the rest of the novel keeps us at arm's length from these Russian aristocrats, but in this passage, the distance between the reader and the character is almost completely erased. Anna's pain and desperation are visceral, and whether you approve of her choices or not, you can't read about her fate without erasing pulse. Modern writers, of course, have all of these techniques at their disposal. While it may be true that the close third person remains the default mode for many writers, you'll also find that most writers feel free to mix and match the varieties of the third person in surprising and innovative ways. The contemporary American crime novelist George Pelecanos stands in direct line of descent from Dashiell Hammett and Elmore Leonard. And like Hammett and Leonard, much of his narration is of the recording eye variety. In very spare language, Pelecanos gives us detailed descriptions of what his characters look like, what they wear, and what they say and do. His novel The Cut, for example, is told mostly from the point of view of a young private investigator in Washington, D.C. named Spiro Lucas. Much of the story follows Spiro closely as he gets involved in a complicated case involving drug dealers. But occasionally, the narration varies from the remote third person into the close third person. In this passage, for example, Spiro, in the manner of all warm-blooded private detectives, is leaving the home of a woman named Lisa Weitzman, with whom he has just had a one-night stand. His father had once told him, "Don't let anything walk past you," and Lucas knew well what that meant. There are opportunities that are there for only a short period of time and only available to people of a certain age. He and Lisa Weitzman understood. They'd had fun. He didn't want to be one of those sad middle-aged guys who think about the women they should have bedded in their youth if only they'd been less sensible. He planned to age with good memories. This is one of the rare moments in the book when we get direct access to Spiro's thoughts and feelings, but in the context of a detective thriller, it's enough. What's even more interesting, however, is that Pelecanos himself very occasionally steps in to pass judgment on his character in the 19th century manner. Here's Spiro not long after his one-night stand, delivering a bunch of roses to Lisa's door. He went up the steps of Lisa Weitzman's home and laid the roses, heavily wetted, on her doorstep, along with a note he had written in a childish scrawl before getting out of his vehicle. The note was corny and obvious, something about how nice it was to hang out with her. He had no plans to try and see her again, but he wanted to do something respectful for her, at least. Flowers had come to mind. He was a resourceful, but not particularly original young man. Much of the judgment in this paragraph is implicit. The childish scrawl of the note, its corny and obvious wording, but there's a stinger in the tail of the paragraph. Like George Eliot passing bemused judgment on Dr. Lydgate's distaste for brainy women, Pelecanos himself briefly steps in to let us know that Spiro still has some growing up to do. Little moments like this help to make it clear that the author doesn't necessarily endorse everything his protagonist does. You can do this in the first person only by implication, but in the third person, you can come right out and say what you think. In the next lecture, I'll be talking about the various ways setting can be used in fiction, and we'll be looking at some famous bits of scene setting from Dickens' Bleak House and The Lord of the Rings, as well as some different uses of setting from Mr. Pelecanos and the British writer Rosemary Sutcliffe. In the meantime, here's an exercise that explores some of the power and flexibility of the third person. Pick a stressful or contentious situation between two characters, such as an argument between a husband and wife, or an interrogation scene where a cop is trying to get a confession out of a suspect. Then, tell the scene 3 different ways, each in the third person. Once in the close third person from the point of view of one character, the cop, for example, and then tell the same situation again in the close third person from the point of view of the suspect. Then, in the third paragraph, try to go all George Eliot and look on the scene from the omniscient third person, showing the same situation again from a godlike perspective. Every story has a setting, but setting is not equally important to all stories. For some narratives, setting is just a painted theatrical backdrop against which the story plays out. And that backdrop can be changed for another one without fundamentally changing the story itself. Think of those modern dress Shakespeare productions where Richard III is played as a fascist from the 1930s, or Macbeth is played as an ambitious investment banker, or the Montagues and the Capulets in Romeo and Juliet are portrayed as rival street gangs in Miami. And it's not just Shakespeare. One of the best films ever made from a Jane Austen novel is the 1990s teen comedy Clueless. This film very successfully and surprisingly faithfully sets Austen's novel Emma in a contemporary Los Angeles high school. Here's another example. Christina Stead's brilliant novel about a dysfunctional family, The Man Who Loved Children, was originally set in Stead's native Australia. But in order to make it more appealing to American readers, she was persuaded by her publisher to move the setting to Washington, D.C. In most contemporary fiction, however, setting is important. Much of what can make a novel or story memorable is the author's careful evocation of a particular place and time. To pick two obvious examples, Raymond Chandler's Philip Marlowe novels are inextricably linked with Los Angeles in the middle part of the 20th century. And Flannery O'Connor's stories will be forever associated with the rural American South. An evocative and memorable setting doesn't even have to be real. Much of the appeal of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings comes from the way its characters and the reader move through the lovingly detailed landscape of Middle-earth. Tolkien's settings are so detailed and evocative that if you've read Lord of the Rings more than once, as I have, chances are you could be dropped anywhere in Middle-earth and find your way around. Setting can also mean a particular time period as well. The British novelist Hilary Mantel is famous for her attention to historical accuracy in her novels set in the court of Henry VIII, Wolf Hall, and Bring Up the Bodies. And the thrillers of Alan Furst owe much of their excitement to his detailed evocation of Europe during the rise of the Nazis. Another writer who is known for her evocative settings is Rosemary Sutcliffe, who is best known for her series of young adult novels about Roman Britain, The Eagle of the Ninth, The Silver Branch, and The Lantern Bearers. Each of these books skillfully evokes both the time period and the landscape of ancient Britain and Scotland. Sutcliffe had a keen appreciation of the natural world and a sharp eye for the telling detail. Of course, all fictional narratives are set somewhere, whether the particular setting is essential or not. At the very least, setting establishes a context for the characters and the plot, since not even fictional characters come out of nowhere. Sometimes it's just a backdrop. Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene. But more often than not, setting does more in the narrative than just situating us in time and place. In this lecture, I want to talk first about some of the purposes to which setting can be put in a narrative. After that, I'll talk about how you can evoke setting in a story, which depends on the purpose of the setting. Let's start by looking at some of the ways that you can use setting in a story or a novel. In many narratives, setting can be a metaphor for the narrative as a whole. One of the most famous examples is the opening paragraph of Bleak House, Charles Dickens' great novel about a complicated and never-ending lawsuit in mid-19th century England. Here are the opening words. London, Michaelmas term lately over, and the Lord Chancellor is sitting in Lincoln's Inn Hall. Implacable November weather. As much mud in the streets as if the waters had but newly retired from the face of the earth, and it would not be wonderful to meet a megalosaurus, 40 feet long or so, waddling like an elephantine lizard up Holborn Hill. Smoke lowering down from chimney pots, making a soft black drizzle with flakes of soot in it as big as full-grown snowflakes. Gone into mourning, one might imagine, for the death of the sun. Dogs, undistinguishable in mire. Horses, scarcely better, splashed to their very blinkers. Foot passengers jostling one another's umbrellas in a general infection of ill temper and losing their foothold at street corners, where tens of thousands of other foot passengers have been slipping and sliding since the day broke, if this day ever broke, adding new deposits to the crust upon crust of mud, sticking at those points tenaciously to the pavement and accumulating at compound interest. The next paragraph is an equally detailed and equally unsettling account of the London fog. Dickens describes how it creeps everywhere and obscures everything, how it gets into the eyes and throats of ancient pensioners by their firesides and pinches the toes and fingers of a ship's apprentice boy. And so before we ever meet a character, and before the plot even starts, Dickens has indelibly evoked a vision of dark, dirty London full of filthy animals, ill-tempered pedestrians, and poor people wheezing and shivering in the all-encompassing fog. This exceptionally vivid setting sets up two purposes. On the one hand, it vividly evokes the sensory details of London in the mind of the reader, the darkness, the cold, the dirt. On the other hand, the setting serves as a metaphor for the misty, insinuating, impenetrably foggy coils of the lawsuit itself. Here's another example. J.G. Farrell's historical novel Troubles is about the Irish rebellion against British rule in the years after World War I. The main setting is a giant resort hotel on the Irish coast called the Majestic. This Baroque old building serves all the way through the novel as a metaphor for the grand, ornate, crumbling edifice of the British Empire. At the end of the novel, the Irish Republican Army burns the hotel to the ground. The actual destruction of the hotel represents the metaphorical destruction of the dominance of Protestants and the British in Ireland. On the last page, the novel's main character, a gentle and befuddled retired British Army major, surveys the ruins, which includes the skeletons of the hundreds of cats that lived in the hotel. There was very little to see except that great collection of wash basins and lavatory bowls which had crashed from one burning floor to another until they reached the ground. He inspected the drips of molten glass which had collected like candle grease beneath the windows. He noted the large number of delicate little skeletons. The charred and roasted demons had been picked clean by the rats. He stepped from one blackened compartment to another, trying to orientate himself and saying, "I'm standing in the residence lounge, in the corridor, in the writing room." Now that these rooms were open to the mild Irish sky, they all seemed much smaller, in fact, quite insignificant. This evocative but brief excerpt can't convey the full effect of this final scene, but take my word for it. The vast, crumbling, mostly empty Majestic is an oppressive presence all the way through the whole book, with its clueless Anglo-Irish owners, its sullen Irish servants, and a surrounding countryside seething with resentment. Even if he or she doesn't know anything about the history of the Irish Revolution, every reader will understand that in that final scene, the Major is surveying the ruins of an empire, and not just a burnt-out old hotel. I want to emphasize that each of these two settings, foggy, dirty London and Bleak House and the Majestic Hotel in Troubles, are also full of vivid sensory details that draw you into the scene and into the book. They put you in the moment, even if you aren't consciously picking up on the metaphor. A setting should be visceral and vivid even when you are using it for a metaphorical purpose. Whatever its symbolic intent, a carefully evoked setting should allow us to experience that imaginary world as if we were characters in the story. You can also use setting to evoke mood, especially when the point of the book is to evoke a strong vicarious emotion. This is especially true in genre fiction such as horror, where you want to evoke fear in a reader. Here's part of a description of a haunted house from the early pages of Judith Hawkes' marvelously creepy novel, Julian's House. Inside the gate, so overgrown with honeysuckle that it no longer swings freely, but seems to protest against being opened, The yard slopes ever so slightly down to the house, and you may find your pace quickening in spite of yourself as you approach. The broad flagstones leading the way are cracked now and worn with the pressure of feet going back and forth across them. Grass springs up in the cracks, and the once sharp edges are soft with moss. Inside the gate a silence falls. Leaves stir and are still. At the foot of the porch steps, the silence deepens, wrapped around with the fragrance of the shallow pink roses that twine the uprights and shadow the wide boards with their leaves. And yet it is more than a silence, as the leaves stir and again are still. It is a silence of breath held, of a sob stifled in a pillow, the silence that follows the blow of a fist upon a table. In the moving leaves, this silence seems to murmur in its sleep, of too many closed doors, keys turning smoothly in well-oiled locks, glances exchanged without words. Even if we hadn't already been told that this is a haunted house, it would be hard to read this description and not sense immediately that there is something wrong with this house, that there is something bad waiting inside. There are a lot of nifty little details in this passage, but I'll just point out one. You might not notice it on a first reading, but Hawkes uses the word silence 6 times in the paragraph. Normally, the repetition of a word that many times in so short a passage is anathema to writers, or at least to copy editors. But here the repetition has the effect of making the silence ominous, like a thundercloud building on the horizon. More importantly, the word silence is paired with such active verbs as falls, deepens, and murmur. The use of these verbs change the silence from the absence of sound to an active presence in the house. This is a very skillful bit of scene setting. You could also use setting to tell us about the characters in a story. A description of a room or a house is often used to tell us something about the person who lives there. One of the major plot lines in George Eliot's Middlemarch is the ill-advised marriage of Dorothea Brooke, an intense young woman in her early 20s, to Edward Casaubon, a dry and humorless scholar who is 30 years her senior. Early in the book, after their surprise engagement, Dorothea goes to visit Mr. Casaubon's home. The building of greenish stone was in the old English style, not ugly, but small-windowed and melancholy-looking, the sort of house that must have children, many flowers, open windows, and little vistas of bright things to make it seem a joyous home. In this latter end of autumn, with a sparse remnant of yellow leaves falling slowly athwart the dark evergreens in a stillness without sunshine, the house, too, had an air of autumnal decline, and Mr. Casaubon, when he presented himself, had no bloom that could be thrown into relief by that background. Now, even if the reader hadn't already begun to suspect that Dorothea's marriage to Casaubon was a bad idea, this description should make up his mind. Nearly everything Eliot says about the house, that it's small-windowed and melancholy, that the grounds around it are dark, still, and without sunshine, and that it has an air of autumnal decline, could also be said about Casaubon himself. The last clause of the passage is one of the great backhanded insults in English literature, when Eliot says that there is nothing about Casaubon himself that could be thrown into relief by his joyless home. Setting can also be used to evoke the passage of time and the movement of characters through a landscape. Tolkien is especially skillful at describing the geography of Middle-earth. In part, this is simply because he delights in evoking the natural world. But these passages also literally slow the narrative down, and this has the effect of evoking the slow passage of characters who are moving on foot through a vast and often spectacular landscape. Here are the hobbits Frodo and Sam passing through the land of Ithilien in the Two Towers. Day was opening in the sky, and they saw that the mountains were now much further off, receding eastward in a long curve that was lost in the distance. Before them, as they turned west, gentle slopes ran down into dim hazes far below. All about them were small woods of resinous trees, fir and cedar and cypress, and other kinds unknown in the Shire, with wide glades among them, and everywhere there was a wealth of sweet-smelling herbs and shrubs. The long journey from Rivendell had brought them far south of their own land, but not until now, in this more sheltered region, had the hobbits felt the change of clime. Here spring was already busy about them. Fronds pierced moss and mold, larches were green-fingered, small flowers were opening in the turf, birds were singing. Ithilien, the garden of Gondor now desolate, kept still a disheveled dryad loveliness. This lovely passage evokes both the vastness of the landscape through which Frodo and Sam are moving, as well as their own sense of wonder at it. Notice how the passage effectively shifts our focus from the long distance to the close-up. We see the mountains as a long curve that was lost in the distance. But in the next sentence, we get particular types of trees, fir and cedar and cypress. And finally, we get the individual harbingers of spring, fronds piercing moss, green-fingered larches, flowers opening in the turf. And the fact that the reader is required to slow down during this passage and to stop and smell the flowers also evokes the slowness of Frodo and Sam's journey. But setting doesn't have to slow down the narrative. You can also use setting to evoke speed and danger. Here's part of a chase scene from Rosemary Sutcliffe's The Eagle of the Ninth. Her two main characters, the Roman soldier Marcus and his slave Esca, are fleeing on horseback across the Scottish Highlands from a band of Pictish tribesmen. He was riding for his life with the dark hunt in full cry behind him, putting out all his skill to keep clear of hidden pitfalls, the hummocks and snags and snarls among the heather that might bring disaster, grimly aware that he could not grip strongly enough with his right knee, and if the pony stumbled at this flying gallop, he would go clean over its head. On and on they hurtled, now skirting a reed-fringed upland pool, now swerving from a patch of bog luminously green in the fading light, uphill and down, through bronze tides of dying heather, startling here a flock of plover, there a stray curlew from the bents, and always, behind them, the hunt drawing nearer. Marcus could hear the hounds giving tongue above the soft thunder of the pony's hooves, nearer, steadily nearer, but there was no time for looking back. Here, as in Tolkien, we can delight in the vivid evocation of the landscape in its own right, the luminous green bogs, the bronze tides of dying heather. But we should also note how Sutcliffe skillfully interweaves the flashes of landscape description with breathless action. It should be obvious from the examples we've already looked at that there are many different ways to evoke setting in fiction. As always, the various methods for evoking setting fall between two ends of a continuum. At one end, you evoke setting by stopping the narrative dead in its tracks and describing a place or time period in detail. At the other end, you barely evoke setting at all. In general, the method of stopping the narrative in its tracks is used in narratives such as Bleak House or Troubles, where the setting is important to the story. At the other extreme, when the setting isn't that important to the story, you simply don't bother with it. Most novels and short stories fall somewhere in between, combining the various methods. Let's take a look at some examples. We'll start with the two opposite poles and then examine some examples that fall somewhere in between. In narratives that rely upon standalone descriptions of setting, the point of view the writer is using determines how she evokes the setting. The omniscient third person is going to be more cinematic, like an objective camera eye. Take the opening of Bleak House that we looked at earlier. It's like a crane shot in a movie, one that starts high up, smoke lowering down from chimney pots, making a soft black drizzle, then slowly descends to street level, dogs undistinguishable in mire. There it becomes a tracking shot, showing us the masses of Londoners struggling through the mud and the fog, but not from any individual person's point of view. Foot passengers jostling one another's umbrellas in a general infection of ill temper. And remember, this passage does two things simultaneously. It gives our mind's eye something to look at, and it introduces a central metaphor for the plot. Now, when a standalone set-piece description of setting is told from the limited third person or the first person point of view, it also does one more thing, namely, it evokes character. How the character sees the setting, what details he or she picks out as important, tell us something about the person through whose eyes we, the readers, are seeing them. J.G. Farrell's Troubles is told in the close third person from the point of view of Major Archer, a shell-shocked veteran of World War I. A diffident and sometimes befuddled man, Archer walks through the burnt-out ruins of the Majestic at the end of the book and merely takes note of the melted glass and the skeletons of dead cats. The metaphorical intent of the scene is lost on the Major. He does not draw any of the connections between the Majestic Hotel and the British Empire. Instead, it's the author who makes that connection, by using that narrative double consciousness that I talked about in a previous lecture. In the last sentence of the paragraph I quoted earlier, Farrell writes, "Now that these rooms were open to the mild Irish sky, they all seemed much smaller, in fact, quite insignificant." This is an oblique, sly, but sharp comment about the end of empire, and it doesn't come from Major Archer, but from the author. A setting can become even more multi-layered when it is described from the first-person point of view. A few minutes ago, I said that setting is part of the appeal of the novels of Raymond Chandler because of the way he records the city of Los Angeles during a particular time in its history. But what makes the setting especially distinctive in Chandler is the fact that it is seen through the eyes and mind of Chandler's main character and protagonist, the private detective Philip Marlowe. Here's the second paragraph of Chandler's first novel, The Big Sleep, in which Marlowe is entering the Los Angeles mansion of a rich client named General Sternwood. The main hallway of the Sternwood place was 2 stories high. Over the entrance doors, which would have let in a troop of Indian elephants, there was a broad stained glass panel showing a knight in dark armor rescuing a lady who was tied to a tree and didn't have any clothes on, but some very long and convenient hair. The knight had pushed the visor of his helmet back to be sociable, and he was fiddling with the knots on the ropes that tied the lady to the tree and not getting anywhere. I stood there and thought that if I lived in the house, I would sooner or later have to climb up there and help him. He didn't seem to be really trying. This goes on for another couple of paragraphs, but this is enough to make my point. This paragraph does several things all at once. First, it sets the scene visually so we know where we are. Second, it tells us right from the start that General Sternwood is very rich, an impression that is immediately reinforced by the next 2 paragraphs and several other passages of description later in the chapter. Third, it tells us a good deal about Marlowe himself. We learn that he is an alert, sharp-eyed, and witty observer of his surroundings. We learn that he quickly takes the measure of his environment and the people he meets. Fourth, the stained glass window with the knight and the naked lady foreshadows the plot. General Sternwood is being blackmailed by a photographer who has taken nude pictures of his youngest daughter. Marlowe is being hired to become, in effect, the knight in dark armor whose job it is to free her from the pornographer's clutches. Let's take a look now at a writer who scarcely evokes setting at all, at least not in the modern sense, Jane Austen. Compared to a modern writer, Austen hardly ever describes anything, either settings or characters. Mr. Darcy is the leading man of Pride and Prejudice, and here is the only physical description he gets in the entire book. Mr. Darcy soon drew the attention of the room by his fine, tall person, handsome features, noble mien. That's it. That's all we get of him, a description that could fit any number of men. Well, the same goes for Austen's evocations of setting. Her description of Mr. Darcy's mansion, Pemberley, is slightly more extensive than her description of Darcy himself, but not by much. The eye was instantly caught by Pemberley House, situated on the opposite side of the valley, into which the road with some abruptness wound. It was a large, handsome stone building, standing well on rising ground and backed by a ridge of high woody hills. And in front, a stream of some natural importance was swelled into greater, but without any artificial appearance. That's all there is, and none of it is particularly evocative. Note in particular the abstract adjectives she uses to describe the house itself, as opposed to the landscape in which it sits. All she tells us about the house is that it is large, handsome, and made of stone. Just as Darcy's description could describe half the titled landowners in England, the description of his home could fit nearly every other English country house at the time. And yet, it's not fair to say that Austen was completely uninterested in evoking setting. Jane Austen could rely upon the fact that she and her readers shared a social and geographical context, and so she could use a kind of shorthand. Reading novels was still mostly an elite practice in Austen's day. She knew that her educated readers would recognize the real places she cited in the text, and then be able to interpolate the nature and approximate location of the fictional places. The village of Longbourn, in Pride and Prejudice, for example, is fictional, but it is situated in the real English county of Hertfordshire, and Austen could count on her readers knowing what Hertfordshire looks like. In the same novel, another family, the Gardiners, live on Gracechurch Street, a real street in London, and Austen knew that her readers would know where Gracechurch Street is and what sort of people live there. Put it in modern terms, you might say that Jane Austen was relying on the brand names of her day to evoke setting, which is a technique many of our contemporary writers rely upon. The crime thrillers of George Pelecanos, for example, are very specifically set in Washington, D.C., and they are often set in a specific year. He evokes the time period by telling you what pop songs a character hears on the radio, and he often describes characters by telling us the brand names of their clothes. On the very first page of his novel The Cut, for example, we're told that the main character, Spiro Lucas, is wearing Carhartt jeans and that he's taking notes in a black moleskin notebook. And throughout the novel, Pelecanos skillfully combines real street and place names with brief bits of description. Here's a passage in which Spiro Lucas drives out of the city and then rides his bicycle to reconnoiter a suspicious location. He drove out to Hyattsville, Maryland, via Queens Chapel Road and Hamilton Street, and stopped in the lot of the 38th Street Park, through which ran the paved Northwest Branch Trail. He got onto his bike and pedaled southeast, staying in the middle gears, through open fields, past woods, across Rhode Island Avenue, and finally across alternate Route 1, navigating through fast vehicular traffic. He dipped down into Tanglewood Drive, entered the industrial district of Edmonston, and cruised at a steady pace. All of these places are real. You can get on Google Street View, like I did when I read The Cut, and follow this route in every detail. The downside to a description like this is that if you don't know Hyattsville, Maryland, as well as Spiro Lucas or George Pelecanos do, your eye is likely to glide over these names. On the other hand, the author's use of these real place names bespeaks an authority and an intimacy with the setting that can be just as compelling to a reader as a more detailed description. In the context of a fast-paced thriller, this sort of description may even be more compelling. Even if you have never crossed Rhode Island Avenue through traffic, the passage evokes the confidence and expertise of Spiro Lucas. And of course, there's that vast middle ground of narratives between those that use standalone set-piece descriptions and those that rely simply on place names. Let's go back to that breathless chase scene from Rosemary Sutcliffe's The Eagle of the Ninth and look at one particular sentence. On and on they hurtled, now skirting a reed-fringed upland pool, now swerving from a patch of bog luminously green in the fading light, uphill and down, through bronze tides of dying heather, startling here a flock of plover, there a stray curlew from the bents, and always behind them the hunt drawing nearer. Note how this long sentence starts with action, on and on they hurtled, and then launches into a series of adjective phrases with a participle at the end of each phrase, skirting, swerving, startling. Each one of these adjective phrases modifies the pronoun they at the beginning of the sentence. Now note how within each phrase the participle is linked with a vivid feature of the landscape, skirting a reed-fringed upland pool, swerving round a patch of bog, startling a flock of plover. In this way, Sutcliffe skillfully evokes both motion and landscape, not only in the same paragraph, not only in the same sentence, but in the same phrase. Now, whether you choose to lavish your reader with a richly detailed Technicolor description or just say that your detective walked into a Starbucks, remember that in most cases, how you use setting depends on the overall purpose of your narrative. Scene by scene, you want to lavish detailed descriptions on settings that recur or are especially important. But you only need a line or two to evoke settings that don't matter as much or that only turn up once. If a particular setting looms over the whole narrative, the way the majestic hotel looms over J.G. Farrell's novel Troubles, then you will constantly return to the setting as the story goes on, the way Farrell does. If you want to evoke the slow passage of travelers on foot across a landscape, then you will slow the narrative down for long descriptions of that landscape, the way Tolkien does in Lord of the Rings. But if you want to evoke an intense, energetic, young private investigator speeding on his bicycle through a modern-day industrial park, you want to pick up the pace and just use place names, the way George Pelecanos does in The Cut. Now, here are a couple of different exercises you could try in order to explore the use of setting in a narrative. As I said earlier, one of the things you can do with setting is evoke character. So try describing the same setting from the point of view of two different characters who want different things. Take Sarah and Brad, for example, the unhappily married couple in my narrative from the first lecture. As you may recall, they're at a baseball game. So try describing the ballpark in two different ways. Show it first from Sarah's point of view, bearing in mind that she's about to ask for a divorce, and then show it from Brad's, bearing in mind that he has no idea what she's about to ask him. You could also explore just how important a particular setting is to a narrative by taking a famous novel or story and setting it in a radically different place or time from the original. As I said at the start of this lecture, people do this with Shakespeare all the time, and even with Jane Austen upon occasion. But you could rewrite a scene from, say, Huckleberry Finn that was set someplace other than the Mississippi. Or could one of the scenes from The Great Gatsby take place at any other place or time other than Long Island in the Jazz Age? Meanwhile, in the next lecture, I'll be talking about pacing in fiction, and we'll be looking at a variety of works, including Leo Tolstoy's novella The Death of Ivan Ilyich, Alice Munro's great short story The Beggar Maid, and Eleanor Catton's Booker Prize-winning novel The Luminaries, and John le Carré's classic spy thriller, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy.